Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories.
Hey, my dear friends, hope you're ready.
Or if this is your first visit, it's truly good to have you. Get nice and comfortable. Maybe pull up a blanket. Turn the lights down just a bit. Because tonight we're heading back. Far back to a universe of candlelit sitting rooms, extended dining tables, white gloves, and guidelines. So many guidelines for everything. We're stepping into the Victorian household. Picture this. It's the year 1846. You pick up a newspaper in London, and there on the front page is a picture, a huge radiant family portrait. A lovely young queen sits at the center. Her husband stands beside her, tall and solemn. Around them, 5 rosy-cheeked children beam like small angels. Everyone is flawlessly dressed. Everyone is smiling just enough, not too broad, just the perfect measure of proper happiness. The whole image radiates warmth, goodness, and structure. And an entire country looks at that picture and thinks, that is what a family ought to look like. But here is the thing nobody mentions. That painting was false. Not in the way obvious lies are told. Nobody in that portrait was hiding a secret identity or fleeing the law. The untruth was something quieter and in many ways far more potent. It was the untruth of the flawless household. A deliberately crafted image designed to instruct ordinary people how they were supposed to exist, who they were supposed to be, and what they were supposed to desire. And once that image was released into the world, it didn't merely hang on a wall. It seeped into every home in Britain. It crossed the ocean to America. It climbed into the dreams of the rising working class, the hopes of mothers, the standards of fathers, and the quiet pressures placed on every child who was ever told to sit upright and behave. Tonight, we dismantle that picture. Because behind the lace window treatments and the polished silverware and the family Bible on the shelf, the Victorian household was not the heaven it seemed to be. It was something far more nuanced, far more human, and in some ways far more sorrowful. And before we go any further into this tale, if you're enjoying this kind of late-night journey through the past, it truly means everything to me. When you hit that subscribe button, leave a like or post a comment down below. Tell me where you are right now as you listen to this. Are you in bed on the sofa? Maybe it's 3 in the morning and you simply can't rest. Whatever your story is, I want to hear it. This little group we're creating together is the reason I keep showing up every night with stories like this one. Now, dim those lights just a little more if you can. Maybe turn on a soft fan or let the quiet of the evening settle around you, because the finest way to visit the past is gently. So,
Let us go back to that picture.
it was called The Royal Family in 1846, painted by the German artist Franz Xaver Winterhalter. Queen Victoria commissioned it herself, and it wasn't simply a portrait. It was, as historians would later describe it, a deliberate piece of royal messaging. Consider what was happening in England at that time. Victoria's 2 uncles, who had ruled before her, King George IV and King William IV, had been, to put it kindly, somewhat disastrous. George IV famously despised his wife, drained the royal treasury on absurd luxuries, and had so many lovers that the press openly laughed at him. William IV had 10 illegitimate children before he wed. The crown was not exactly shining with moral authority. Victoria understood this. Albert understood this. And so, very intentionally, they decided to become something different. They became the image. Victoria and Albert grasped with nearly modern instinct that the picture of a cheerful, wholesome, morally upright royal household could be one of the most effective political tools imaginable. So they commissioned paintings. They sat for photographs. Albert was among the very first members of the British royal family ever to be photographed in 1842. They opened up their private Christmas celebrations. In 1848, a sketch of the royal family gathered around their Christmas tree at Windsor Castle was published in the Illustrated London News, and within a decade, Christmas trees had spread to middle-class homes across Britain and America. Everything the royal family did publicly was a lesson, a pattern, a guidebook for respectable family life. And the middle class, the rapidly growing, anxious, aspirational Victorian middle class, was desperate for exactly that kind of direction. Here is something worth pausing on because it reveals so much about this time. Before the Victorian period, the idea of the nuclear family as we know it, mother, father, children all living together in their own neat home, emotionally bonded and morally responsible to each other, was not actually the dominant model of family life. Households were messier, more extended, more economically motivated. People married because they needed to get by, not because they had discovered their perfect match. Emotional closeness between parents and children was not particularly valued by upper-class society. Many wealthy children were given to wet nurses and maids almost immediately after birth and barely knew their parents until they were old enough to be helpful. But then something changed. The Industrial Revolution changed it, when factories began pulling men away from home to work long hours in cities. And when the newly wealthy merchant class began moving into their own separate houses, away from the old extended family structures, something curious occurred. The home became a sanctuary, a private world apart from the noise and moral confusion of the industrial city outside, and the woman became its caretaker. Suddenly, the family was not just a practical setup. It was a moral undertaking, and someone needed to create the rules for how that undertaking was supposed to function. Enter the advice books. If you had been a middle-class woman in Victorian England or America, because these ideas crossed the ocean very quickly, your shelf would almost certainly have contained at least one of these. Volumes like The Habits of Good Society, published in 1861, or Isabella Beeton's legendary book of household management, also 1861, which told women in extraordinary detail how to handle every single aspect of domestic life, from how to speak to staff to the correct way to fold a napkin. These books were not simply guides. They were effectively a second scripture for the Victorian household, and what they described collectively was a very specific vision of family life. The husband as the head of the household, the earner the moral authority, the wife as the angel of the home, selfless, tender, endlessly patient, cheerfully obedient, the children as small projects in moral training to be formed and corrected until they were ready for respectable society. It all sounded lovely, and for some families perhaps some of it was. But the gap between the image and the truth, between the picture and the actual breathing, complicated lives of real Victorian families was enormous. Consider for a moment Queen Victoria herself, the woman at the center of the whole ideal. Victoria was not, by her own admission, particularly fond of babies. She described pregnancy in her private letters as the shadow side of marriage, which is a rather elegant way of saying she found it draining and undignified. She had 9 children in 17 years. 9. She reportedly told her eldest daughter after the birth of her first child that she hoped her daughter would not end up having as many children as she had. She and Albert fought loudly, violently enough on occasion that the staff could hear them through the walls. Albert, for all his magnificent public image as the ideal Victorian husband, was not exactly an equal partner in practice. He controlled the household finances. He determined how the children were taught. He had a deeply complicated relationship with their eldest son, the future King Edward VII, whom he considered intellectually lacking, and whom he subjected to a punishing educational schedule that reportedly contributed to the young man's lasting resentment of everything his father stood for. None of this appeared in the paintings. None of this appeared in the photographs. What the public saw was the lace and the glow. What occurred behind the palace doors was something else entirely. And that gap between the public image and the private truth was not unique to the royal family. It became in many ways the defining feature of Victorian family life at every level of society. The Victorian household was at its core a performance. Not because Victorian people were uniquely dishonest, but because the social stakes of getting it wrong were extraordinarily high. To be seen as a respectable family, and that word respectable carried enormous weight in this time, you had to appear the part. You had to display the right furniture, the right manners, the right number of staff, the right kind of quiet obedience from your children, the right kind of cheerful submission from your wife. Anything that strayed from that image, poverty scandal, unconventional relationships, a wife who spoke too freely, a child who didn't listen, was not just a private shame. It was a social catastrophe. And so families learned to conceal, to manage appearances, to uphold the illusion. Entire histories of pain, of affection, of secret grief, of quiet defiance were hidden behind parlor doors that were never opened to outsiders. That is the story we're going to explore tonight. Not the image, not the ideal, but the real Victorian household with all its unspoken regulations, its concealed tensions, its remarkable cruelties, and its surprising moments of kindness. Because here is what I find most fascinating about all of this. These rules, the ones that shaped how Victorian families lived, how they treated each other, how they defined love and duty and honor, they did not disappear when Queen Victoria died in 1901. They trickled down through generations. They shaped the grandparents of people who are alive today. They are embedded faintly but unmistakably in ideas that many of us still hold about what a household is supposed to look like. And to understand where those ideas came from, to see them clearly with all their beauty and all their harm, we have to go back to where they began. So let's keep moving. Because the Victorian world had a hidden rule for nearly everything, and perhaps nowhere was that more true than in the most personal legal agreement a Victorian woman ever signed. when she said, "I do." What happened to a woman the moment she became a wife in Victorian England is one of the most remarkable and quietly devastating legal narratives in all of Western history. And that is exactly where we are headed next. There is a legal term you've almost certainly never heard. And once I explain what it means, you will never forget it. The term is coverture, and if you'd been a woman living in Victorian England, this single word would have quietly governed every single aspect of your existence from the instant you spoke your wedding vows until the day you left this earth. Let me paint the scene slowly. Imagine you are a woman. It is, say, the year 1850. You are bright, perhaps educated, maybe even talented, a writer, a poet, someone who earns her own money and holds her own views. You have property, perhaps left to you by your father. You have a little savings. You have a name. Then you get married. And on that day, on that very day, before the wedding cake is even sliced, you legally cease to exist. Not figuratively, not metaphorically, literally in the eyes of English law. William Blackstone, the most influential legal scholar of the time, spelled it out in his famous commentaries on the laws of England, with a calmness that is almost breathtaking. By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law, and that person is the husband. One person, the husband. Your money became his. Your property became his. Your earnings became his. Any books you wrote, any paintings you sold, any copyrights in your name, all of it transferred to him the moment you walked down the aisle. You could not sign a contract. You could not write a legal will. You could not sue anyone in a court of law, not even in most circumstances, your own husband. If someone lied about you in the newspaper and you wanted to fight back, your husband had to be the one to file the lawsuit, because legally you were not there to be hurt. You were in the cold language of the law, a femme covert, a woman undercover, under the cover of her husband's identity. And here is the part that still makes my breath catch when I consider it carefully. A single woman, an unmarried woman, a widow had more legal rights than a married one. The moment you chose affection and commitment and said yes, you gave up what little freedom you had. The law had quite brilliantly and quite ruthlessly made marriage itself the prison. Now you might be sitting there thinking, surely this was just a formal legal detail. Surely most husbands were reasonable people who didn't actually exploit this. Surely most families functioned more or less as partnerships. And yes, many did. But that is almost beside the point. The danger of coverture was not only in what cruel husbands could do. It was in what any husband could do at any moment without warning, without consequence, and entirely within his legal rights. And nothing illustrates this more clearly than the story of a woman named Caroline Norton. Caroline Sheridan was born in 1808, granddaughter of the famous Irish playwright Richard Brinsley Sheridan. She was witty, brilliant, lovely, and by all accounts, a devoted mother of 3 young sons. In 1827, at 19 years old, she married a man named George Norton, a lawyer, a member of Parliament, and as it would emerge, a man with a violent temper and a deeply spiteful soul. The marriage deteriorated quickly. George Norton beat her repeatedly, badly enough that in 1835, while she was pregnant with their 4th child, a beating caused her to miscarry. She tried to leave. She tried to find legal separation. And then she discovered something that destroyed whatever hope she had left. Under English law, she had no rights to her children at all. None. The children, her children, the boys she had raised and nursed and loved, were in the eyes of the law the legal property of their father. George Norton understood this perfectly. When the marriage finally collapsed in 1836, he acted swiftly and without mercy. He took the 3 boys, the eldest was around 7, the youngest just a toddler, and sent them to live with relatives. He refused to tell Caroline where they were. He refused her access. And then, in a move of extraordinary cruelty, he sued Lord Melbourne, the sitting Prime Minister of England and a close friend of Caroline's, for criminal conversation, which is a rather Victorian way of saying adultery. Consider what this moment meant. The trial was held on June 23rd, 1836. It was a national spectacle. Charles Dickens, yes, that Charles Dickens, who was then working as a newspaper reporter, covered the proceedings. Seats in the gallery sold for what would be roughly $600 in today's money. The entire country was watching, and Caroline Norton, the woman at the center of the entire scandal, was not permitted to be represented by counsel. She could not speak in her own defense. She could not even sit in the courtroom as a legal party. Because she was a married woman, she had no legal standing. The jury ultimately found Melbourne innocent. The trial had been a circus built on George Norton's anger and wounded pride. But innocent verdicts, as history shows us, do not undo social damage. Caroline was labeled a scandalous woman. Her reputation was in ruins. Her sons were still gone, and George, vindicated by his own legal victory, still refused to give her children back. So Caroline did the one thing that was still hers to do. She wrote in 1837 she published a pamphlet with a title so direct it reads almost like a cry of pain. Observations on the natural claims of a mother to the custody of her children as affected by the common law rights of the father. She printed 500 copies and put them personally into the hands of every member of Parliament she could reach. Then she wrote another pamphlet, then another. She wrote letters to the Lord Chancellor. She wrote to the press, she wrote. And this detail I find remarkable directly to the young Queen Victoria, asking the new Queen to consider the suffering of women trapped by laws they had no voice in making. She was not a feminist in the way we would use that word today. She was careful to say she was not asking for women's equality, only for a mother's right to her own children. But in doing so, she lit a fire that burned far beyond what even she intended. In 1839, the Custody of Infants Act was passed, the first law in English history to recognize that a mother had any claim to her children after separation. In 1857, the Matrimonial Causes Act created a civil court for divorce for the first time. Before then, only an act of Parliament could dissolve a marriage, and about 10 such acts were passed per year in the entire country, mostly for wealthy men. In 1870, the Married Women's Property Act began to chip away at coverture, finally allowing women to keep their own wages. And in 1882, the Follow-up Act took the final formal step, recognizing the wife as a separate legal person from her husband for the first time since medieval English common law had decided otherwise. 1 woman, 3 pamphlets, 45 years of change. But I want to stay with Caroline for one more moment, because history has a habit of letting the story end neatly with legislative victories, and the reality was far less neat. Her youngest son, William, never came home safely. In 1842, 6 years after George took the boys, the child fell from his horse while riding alone. The injuries seemed minor at first, but they were left untreated. Blood poisoning set in. George, perhaps suddenly aware that he needed Caroline's help, sent word to her. She traveled through the night to reach him. She arrived after William had already died. She had missed his last hours by a matter of hours, because for 6 years she had not been permitted to be near him. The law that she had fought so hard to pass, the Custody of Infants Act of 1839, was passed in the same year that her youngest son died. She had changed the law for thousands of other mothers, but she could not change it fast enough to save her own child. Now, I want to ask you something honestly, and I genuinely want you to sit with this question for a moment. When you hear a story like Caroline's, does it feel like distant history, or does it feel like something that with just a few adjustments of detail could still happen somewhere in the world today? Because the mechanics of coverture, the idea that marriage can erase a person's legal identity, that a woman's freedom ends the moment she becomes a partner, these are not simply Victorian problems. There are ideas that have echoes that stretch much further than most of us are comfortable admitting. And even in Victorian England, where the formal law was what it was, where coverture sat, written in black ink in the statute books, there were women who found ways to exist around it, to carve out small spaces of freedom within a system designed to contain them. Some of those women are the most remarkable people I've ever researched. But to understand how they lived and what it cost them, we need to understand something else about the Victorian world first. Because the law of coverture was only one half of the cage. The other half was something far less visible, far more psychological. It was not written in any statute book, and in some ways it was even harder to fight than the law. It was the idea that the entire world was divided into 2 separate realms, and that a woman's place was fixed immovably permanently in only one of them. The Victorians even had a name for it. They called it the doctrine of the separate spheres, and that is exactly where our story goes next. So we've established 2 things. The Victorian household looked flawless from the outside, and the law quietly, systematically made sure that women had almost no authority within it. But here is what I keep turning over in my mind as I study this era. And maybe you feel this too. The law alone cannot explain everything. Laws can be changed. Laws eventually were changed. And yet the grip the Victorian era had on how families were supposed to function lasted far, far longer than any piece of legislation. Which means something else was at work, something deeper, something that lived not in the courts but in the culture itself. And that something had a name. They called it the doctrine of the separate spheres. And if coverture was the cage, the separate spheres was the story people told themselves about why the cage was actually a garden. Here is the idea at its core, as simply as I can put it. The Victorians believed genuinely, sincerely, almost religiously, that men and women were not just different by custom or tradition, but different by nature, different in their very spirits. And because they were so fundamentally different, they belonged in entirely different worlds. The man's world was the public sphere. Work, commerce, politics, law, the city streets, the railway carriages, the smoking rooms, and the gentlemen's clubs were the place where the real decisions of the age were made. This was a rough, moral, ambiguous, competitive place, and men being naturally rational, aggressive, and independent were perfectly suited to survive it. The woman's world was the private sphere, the home, the nursery, the sitting room, the garden, the church pew on Sunday morning. This was a space of purity and stillness, and women being naturally tender, moral, and self-sacrificing were perfectly suited to preside over it. And here is the part that strikes me every time I return to it. The Victorians genuinely framed this arrangement not as a restriction on women, but as an elevation of them. Women, they said, were morally superior to men. They were purer, more spiritual, more virtuous. The home was not a prison, it was a sanctuary, and the woman was not a prisoner. She was its guardian angel. That is literally what they called her, the angel in the house. In 1854, a poet named Coventry Patmore published a long narrative poem with exactly that title, The Angel in the House. It was based on his own marriage to his wife Emily, whom he genuinely adored and whom he held up as the perfect model of Victorian womanhood. When it was first published, the poem received almost no attention at all. The literary establishment largely ignored it, which is a rather remarkable irony given what happened next. Slowly, steadily across the second half of the 19th century, the poem found its audience. It was reprinted. It was read aloud in drawing rooms. It crossed the Atlantic and became enormously popular in the United States. By the time it had fully saturated the culture, it had been reprinted over 60 times, and the image it contained, the woman as selfless, cheerful, spiritually luminous creature, whose entire existence was devoted to the comfort and moral elevation of her husband, had become something very close to a national creed. Patmore's ideal wife, Honoria, had no ambitions of her own, no desires that existed outside of her husband's needs. She was, as Virginia Woolf would describe her with razor-sharp irony decades later, intensely sympathetic, immensely charming, utterly unselfish. She excelled in the difficult arts of family life. If there was a chicken, she took the leg. If there was a draft, she sat in it. Woolf wrote that in 1931, and she added famously that killing this particular ideal, murdering the angel in the house, was for a woman who wanted to write an absolute necessity, because the angel, beautiful and suffocating as she was, had to be dead before a woman could think freely. Now, let me ask you something that I think is genuinely worth sitting with. Have you ever met someone, a woman, perhaps someone you knew, or maybe even someone in your own family, who seemed to have arranged her entire personality around the comfort of everyone else? Who automatically took the least desirable chair, who automatically deferred, who seemed almost constitutionally unable to say what she actually wanted? And did it ever occur to you to wonder whether that was simply who she was, or whether that was something she'd been taught very thoroughly from a very young age? Because the separate spheres doctrine did not just shape what adult Victorian women did. It shaped what they became from childhood onward. A girl was raised to be gentle, passive, accommodating, religiously devout, and fundamentally incurious about the world beyond her household. Ambition in a woman was not admired. It was seen as a kind of deformity, a sign that something had gone wrong in her moral development. Sarah Stickney Ellis, one of the most widely read advice book writers of the era, put it bluntly in her 1842 book, The Daughters of England. Women must be content to be inferior to men, not equal, not complementary, inferior. And they must not merely accept this, they must embrace it cheerfully as the natural order of things. That book sold in enormous quantities. It was read by mothers who gave it to daughters. It was recommended by clergymen from pulpits. It was in a very real sense the instruction manual for how to raise an angel. But here is what I find most interesting and what gets left out of most retellings of this story. The separate spheres doctrine was not only a cage for women, it was also in its quieter and less discussed way a cage for men. Think about what it actually meant to be a Victorian husband and father in full accordance with the ideal. You left the house early. You worked long hours in the city in an environment that was explicitly described as morally compromising, competitive, ruthless, corrupting. You were expected to be strong, silent, rational, undemonstrative. You were not supposed to cry. You were barely supposed to admit fatigue. Any softness, any visible emotional need was considered a step towards something the Victorians found deeply alarming: unmanliness. And then you came home to a household managed entirely by your wife, where you were nominally the master, but practically somewhat of a guest, where the children were largely in the care of servants and a governess, where the emotional rhythms of daily life had proceeded all day without you and would close again around you like water closing over a stone. John Tosh, the British historian who has written perhaps most insightfully about Victorian masculinity, describes a pattern that became increasingly common among middle-class men in the second half of the 19th century. A slow, almost unconscious withdrawal from the home, not from financial obligation they continued to provide, but from presence, from emotional engagement. They retreated to their clubs. They retreated into work. They retreated into the very public sphere that the doctrine of separate spheres had designated as their natural domain, because at least there the rules were clear. And the result for both men and women was a particular kind of loneliness that had no name in Victorian vocabulary. Two people living under the same roof, raising children together, and inhabiting entirely separate emotional universes. There is a detail from this era that I keep returning to because it captures something so precise about this dynamic. In a great many Victorian middle-class homes, the husband and wife only shared 2 meals a day together, breakfast and dinner. The rest of the day they moved in entirely different worlds, and even at those meals the conversation was carefully regulated. Certain topics were considered unsuitable for the dinner table. Business worries, financial anxieties, political controversies, these belonged to the public sphere, and bringing them home was seen as a kind of pollution of the sacred domestic space. So the Victorian husband who had just lost a significant amount of money in a bad investment, or who was under crushing pressure at work, or who was genuinely frightened about something, could not bring that into his own dining room. He had to sit across from his wife and talk about the weather, the parish garden party, whether young Bertie's Latin was improving, and the wife, meanwhile, who perhaps had a mind perfectly capable of engaging with financial reality, who perhaps had insights or opinions that might have genuinely helped, had been trained since girlhood that such matters were not her concern. 2 intelligent people, 1 table, and a silence between them that was not natural at all, but constructed, carefully, deliberately, culturally constructed. Of course, and this is important, the separate spheres ideology, like coverture, was not the same for everyone. It was at its heart a middle-class ideal, a certain kind of respectable, comfortable domesticity that required above all the luxury of having a wife who did not need to work. Working-class women could not afford to be angels. They worked in factories, they took in laundry, they scrubbed floors. The ideology was supposed to be a universal aspiration, but in practice it was a class marker as much as anything else. A middle-class family that could display a wife who stayed beautifully at home was advertising its own prosperity as surely as if it had hung a sign in the window. And here is the quietly devastating irony of that. The very women who most embodied the angel ideal, the ones who genuinely devoted themselves to the domestic sphere, who turned down education, who laid aside ambition, who arranged every atom of their existence around husband and home, these were often the women who suffered most when that home collapsed. When the husband died young, when the money ran out, when the carefully maintained facade cracked open and revealed the terrifying reality underneath, because an angel by definition has no practical skills. She has goodness. She has gentleness. She has an exquisite capacity for self-sacrifice. But goodness does not pay the rent. Virginia Woolf understood this with crystalline clarity, and she said in essence that the angel had to die before women could live. But killing an idea, especially a lovely idea, an idea wrapped in poetry and domestic warmth, and the genuine love of husbands for wives and mothers for children, killing that kind of idea is a very different kind of work than passing a law or winning a court case. You cannot take an ideology to court. You can only outlive it. And the story of how Victorian women and men began to find the cracks in the doctrine of separate spheres began to push against it, question it, exist around it in ways that the advice books never anticipated. That story is one of the most quietly extraordinary chapters in the history of family life. But before we get there, we need to understand something else about the world these families were navigating. Because in between the public sphere and the private sphere, in between the husband who controlled the law and the wife who presided over the home, there was a very particular ritual that governed how anyone got into this arrangement in the first place. We haven't talked yet about courtship. And Victorian courtship, it turns out, was a world unto itself with its own labyrinthine rules, its hidden signals, its extraordinary stakes, and its moments of genuine tenderness wrapped inside layers of performance so thick that even the people living through it sometimes couldn't tell where the theater ended and the real feeling began.
That is where we are headed next.
All right, let us talk about love, or rather, let us talk about what the Victorians called love, while simultaneously doing everything in their considerable power to make sure it never happened too fast, too openly, too honestly, or with anyone from the wrong social class. Because Victorian courtship was one of the most elaborate, ritualized, and I say this with genuine affection, absolutely exhausting social performances in the history of human romance. And the extraordinary thing is that people fell genuinely, deeply, heartbreakingly in love within it. Anyway, here is the first thing you need to understand about finding a partner in Victorian England. It was not at its core a romantic endeavor. It was a negotiation. For a young woman of the middle or upper class, marriage was quite literally the most consequential business transaction she would ever be involved in. And she had to conduct it while wearing 15 pounds of petticoats, speaking in a carefully modulated voice, and pretending she was barely thinking about it at all. For a young man, it was hardly less complicated, choosing a wife of the right social standing, the right family reputation, and the right financial situation could determine the entire arc of his career, his social position, and his children's futures. As historian Sally Mitchell explains in her detailed account of Victorian daily life, courtship was considered more a career move than a romantic interlude, especially for men, because on marriage any property his wife possessed legally became his. And yet, and this is what makes the era genuinely fascinating rather than simply depressing, underneath all of that calculation, young people wanted exactly what young people have always wanted. To be seen, to be chosen, to feel the particular electricity of someone who notices you in a crowded room and cannot look away. The rules of Victorian courtship were at their heart an attempt to manage that electricity to keep it controlled, respectable, and pointing in the right direction. They were not always successful. Let me walk you through what courtship actually looked like step by careful step, because the steps mattered enormously. Miss one, rush one, or perform one out of order, and the social consequences could be severe. It began for a young woman of the upper and middle classes with something called coming out. When a girl reached marriageable age, typically somewhere between 17 and 20 years old, she entered society. Practically speaking, this meant she began putting her hair up, wearing longer skirts, accompanying her family to social events, and making calls with her mother. Among wealthy families, it might mean a formal presentation at court, meeting the Queen herself, followed by a season of balls and dinner parties designed entirely to parade eligible young women in front of eligible young men, which is a description I find equal parts charming and quietly terrifying. The season, as it was called, ran in London roughly from January through July, when Parliament was in session and everyone who was anyone was in town. The calendar was packed. Balls, assemblies, garden parties, theatre evenings, afternoon teas. Every event was both social pleasure and tactical operation. Families spent considerable sums outfitting their daughters for this. Invitations were sent 3 to 6 weeks in advance for major balls. Responding to them promptly within a day was itself a mark of refinement, and every single moment of every single event was governed by rules. An interested gentleman could not simply walk up to a young woman and begin talking to her, not without a formal introduction. Before anything else, before a dance, before a conversation, before so much as the exchange of names, the two parties had to be formally introduced by a mutual acquaintance. Without this introduction, a gentleman who approached a lady was being presumptuous at best and socially threatening at worst. And a lady who acknowledged a gentleman who had not been properly introduced to her was compromising her own reputation. This sounds ridiculous until you remember the stakes. A young woman's reputation was not merely a matter of social pride. It was her entire future. One breath of scandal, one perceived impropriety, one association with the wrong person could close every social door in front of her for years. It could, in the worst cases, make her unmarriageable entirely. So the chaperone was not merely a nuisance. She was, from the family's perspective, a kind of living insurance policy. Everywhere a young unmarried woman went in Victorian society, a chaperone went too. To balls, to evening parties, on carriage rides, on walks in the park. A woman was never to be alone with a gentleman until she was formally engaged to him, and even then the rules were only slightly relaxed. Castell's Household Guide, one of the most widely read etiquette manuals of the era, noted sternly that it was considered excessively vulgar for an engaged woman to clasp her fiancé's arm in public. excessively vulgar for touching her own fiancé's arm. I have to admit, part of me finds a strange sympathy for these young people. All that longing, all that electricity, and so few legitimate outlets for any of it, which is perhaps why they became so extraordinarily creative. One of the most popular romantic myths surrounding Victorian courtship is the idea of a secret language of the fan elaborate gestural codes, where a lady could signal interest, dismissal, or invitation simply by the way she held or moved her folding fan. Open fan held to the heart, I love you. Fanning quickly, I am engaged. Dropping the fan, I belong to you. The whole system sounds almost impossibly romantic, like something from an opera. And here is the lovely, slightly deflating truth that historians have uncovered. The fan language was in large part a marketing invention. Books advertising these codes appeared throughout the era, claiming to teach the reader a secret society of gesture, but virtually none of them could verify that the codes were actually in widespread use. The University of Michigan's Clements Library, which holds one of the finest collections of Victorian social documents in existence, notes that these fan codes were almost certainly the result of advertising campaigns designed to sell accessories, and that the codes were satirized by multiple writers of the period, precisely because they were seen as impractical fantasy rather than real behavior, which I find delightful, honestly, because what it tells you is that even in Victorian England, under all those layers of propriety and chaperonage, there was a human appetite for romance that kept inventing secret languages just to feel less trapped. And the things they did actually use were in some ways even more touching than the fan codes. They wrote letters. The Victorian love letter is one of the genuine wonders of the era because all of those hours that a courting couple could not spend alone together, all of that accumulated longing and observation and careful thought had to go somewhere, and it went onto paper. Couples in serious courtship wrote to each other frequently, sometimes daily. And these letters were not casual communications. They were carefully composed, often ardently felt, and absolutely consequential. They were evidence. Evidence of character, evidence of intention, and critically evidence in a court of law. This is the part that I always find fascinating because it adds an extraordinary layer of calculation to even the most intimate Victorian correspondence. Victorian engagements were legally binding contracts. Breaking one was not a matter of simply saying, "I changed my mind," and moving on with your life. If a man ended an engagement, the woman he had left behind could sue him for breach of promise, and courts took these cases very seriously. Breach of promise suits reached their peak during the Victorian era. A jilted woman could recover damages for costs already incurred, wedding dress trousseau gifts, but also for the far less tangible destruction of her prospects. A long engagement that came to nothing could, in practical terms, take years off a woman's social shelf life, at a time when the window for marriage was considered uncomfortably narrow. And so the love letters written during courtship were not simply expressions of feeling. They were potentially exhibits in a lawsuit. Every careful word, every ardent declaration, every promise implicit or explicit, all of it could end up read aloud in a public courtroom before a jury of 12 men. Charles Dickens, who had an instinct for the grotesque comedy of Victorian social life, made this exact scenario the premise of one of the most beloved sequences in the Pickwick Papers, published in 1836. Pickwick is sued for breach of promise by his landlady, Mrs. Bardell, who had misinterpreted a conversation about hiring a manservant as a proposal of marriage. The trial is a circus of bad faith, unreliable witnesses and legal pomposity, and Dickens clearly intended it as a satirical commentary on the absurdity of a system where the law tried to regulate romantic feeling. But the real breach of promise cases were sometimes far less comic. In the American courts of the same era, which had inherited the same legal tradition, case records show that a 7-year courtship could generate a lawsuit seeking $100,000 in damages. A 14-year courtship resulted in a jury award of $1,425. One newspaper reported without apparent irony a courtship of 21 years that finally culminated in marriage, which makes you wonder with a certain tenderness what on earth they were waiting for. Here is what I keep thinking about when I sit with all of this history. The Victorians surrounded love with an astonishing architecture of rules. The chaperones, the introductions, the engagement contracts, the breach of promise suits, the carefully coded letters written with one eye on posterity and one eye on the law. And you could look at all of that and see only repression, only control, only a system designed to manage women's bodies and men's property. But here is the other thing, the thing that I think deserves to be said quietly and honestly. Couples who spent a full year of carefully supervised courtship, who expressed their feelings primarily through letters, who observed each other across rooms, rather than alone in them, sometimes knew each other in certain ways more deeply than people who leap into intimacy before they have had time to think. There is something in that worth pausing on. Not that the system was right, not that the stakes were fair, especially for women, but that the human desire to be truly known by another person found ways to express itself even within the most constraining of structures. And the letters they wrote to each other, many of which survive in archives and private collections to this day, are some of them extraordinary, full of wit and observation and genuine tenderness, full of the particular ache of wanting someone you're not yet allowed to touch. Do you think you would have been any good at Victorian courtship? Or would you have been the one fanning yourself a little too obviously and accidentally proposing to 3 different people in one evening? Because as carefully choreographed as the courtship was, as mapped out and supervised and legally codified, the world that a couple entered after the wedding was something else entirely. Once the ceremony was over, the rules did not relax. They transformed. The vast, carefully supervised public theatre of courtship gave way to something more private, more claustrophobic in its own way, and governed by a set of power dynamics that most couples had not fully reckoned with until they were already inside them. We have talked about coverture, the law that erased a wife's legal identity. We have talked about the separate spheres, the ideology that confined her to the home. But we have not yet talked about what daily life inside that home actually looked like, who sat where, who spoke when, what was served, and in what order, and what all of it silently communicated about who held power and who did not. The Victorian dinner table, it turns out, was a masterclass in unspoken authority. And we are going to sit down at that table next. Imagine you're standing in the hallway of a well-appointed Victorian townhouse. It is 7 in the evening. The gas lamps are lit. Somewhere from the kitchen below, the smell of a roast joint drifts upward. Maids move through the corridor in near silence. And in the drawing room, the guests have been gathered for 20 minutes now, making small talk, waiting. Then the announcement comes, dinner is served, and what happens next is not simply people walking into a room to eat. What happens next is a performance so precisely choreographed, so layered with meaning, so saturated with social information about who matters, who is watching, and who knows the rules that it puts any modern dinner party to absolute shame. The Victorian dinner table was without question the single most important arena of social display in the entire domestic world. Not the ballroom, not the garden party, the dinner table. This is where reputations were made and quietly damaged. This is where alliances were signaled, wealth was demonstrated, and the question of where you sat in relation to everyone else told the room with elegant precision exactly where you stood in the social order of the universe. Everything began before anyone sat down. The ritual of taking down to dinner was itself a negotiation of rank. The host was responsible for pairing each gentleman with a lady to escort to the table. And the order in which the couples processed into the dining room followed the hierarchy of precedence almost as strictly as a military parade. Married ladies preceded single ladies, elder ladies preceded younger ones, and the highest-ranking woman in the room was escorted by the host himself. If there was any uncertainty about rank, and in Victorian England, where the aristocracy had titles stretching back centuries, and the newly rich industrial families were constantly jostling for position, the host was expected to have consulted Debrets' peerage or Burke's beforehand. These reference books of the nobility were not merely reference books, they were social weapons. Knowing their contents or knowing when to reach for them signaled that you took rank seriously, which was itself a form of status for the emerging middle class flooding into Victorian society from trade and industry. This was a minefield of anxiety. You could have made a fortune in cotton mills. You could have a house large enough to host 20, but if you seated the wrong person in the wrong chair, or addressed the wrong title incorrectly, or confused the order of precedence between a baronet's wife and a knight's widow, the whispers would follow you for seasons. And then there was the matter of where each couple actually sat. The rule seemed simple at first. The hostess sat at the head of the table. The host sat at the foot. The most important guests sat immediately to their right. Married couples were separated, placed at opposite ends or on different sides on the explicit theory that they would simply talk to each other rather than contributing to the general conversation. And that was considered a waste of everyone's time. Etiquette manuals of the 1890s were admirably direct about this. One American guide put it plainly. We should separate husbands from their wives and remove near relations from one another as possible, because being always together, they ought not to converse among themselves at a general party. There is something almost poignant in that. A husband and wife formally separated at their own dinner table so they don't become a conversational island unto themselves. It is the separate spheres doctrine made spatial the dining room as one more arena in which the boundaries between domestic partnership and public performance were carefully maintained, and the seating hierarchy could produce situations of extraordinary absurdity when rank collided with age or expectation. There is the famous example of Consuelo Vanderbilt, the young American heiress, who married the 9th Duke of Marlborough in 1895 in what was widely understood to be a marriage arranged by her formidable mother, largely for the title. Consuelo was 19 years old, but as the wife of a duke, she outranked virtually every other woman in the room, including women in their 50s and 60s, who had spent decades cultivating their social positions through marriage, careful networking, and years of impeccable conduct. By the rules of precedence, a teenager with an American accent and a newly purchased title walked into dinner before all of them. The women she passed were perfectly well bred. They smiled. They said nothing, but they noticed. Now, I want you to close your eyes for a moment, just briefly, and imagine yourself actually sitting at a Victorian dinner table. Not as a guest at a grand aristocratic feast, but as a guest at a comfortable upper-middle-class dinner party. 12 people, good china, correct cutlery, which is a subject unto itself since a properly laid Victorian place setting could include 2 large knives, 3 large forks, a soup spoon, possibly a fish fork and knife, and an oyster fork, all arranged in strict order of use. The sheer number of utensils at your place setting was itself a signal. Poor people used 1 fork. Rich people had specialized equipment for every course. The dinner proceeds in structured courses. Everything began with soup, always soup, summer and winter alike, dispensed by the hostess from a tureen at the head of the table. Then fish, then the roast, then game, then sweets. Upper-class tables might run to 7, 8, or even 12 courses on formal occasions, with each paired to a specific wine served by footmen who moved behind the guests in trained near invisible silence. And while all of this was happening, you were expected to maintain elegant light, careful conversation with the fur. Guests on either side of you, particularly the lady or gentleman to your immediate left or right, you are not to bring up anything controversial. No politics, no religion, no business anxieties, no heated debate of any kind. Queen Victoria herself was famously said to have uttered the phrase, "We are not amused," when a guest told a risque joke at the royal dinner table, breaking the unspoken rule that the table was a space for civilization, not for disorder. Whether she actually said those words is disputed, but the fact that we remember them so vividly says everything about the Victorian idea of what dinner was for. There were rules so counterintuitive that modern guests would violate them constantly without knowing. You were not to blow on your food if it was too hot. You simply waited until it cooled. To blow was piggish. It announced your impatience, your inability to subordinate appetite to decorum. You were not to leave your plate entirely empty at the end of a course. Finishing everything implied you'd not had quite enough, which cast doubt on your host's generosity. Better to leave a small amount as a signal of comfortable sufficiency of a person so well fed in general that they could afford not to scrape the plate. Conversely, you were not to hesitate before taking the last item from a serving dish. To pause, looking uncertain, implied you doubted your host's ability to replenish it. You were to take it with cheerful confidence, as though the kitchen certainly had 10 more just like it. Consider that for a moment. Every single instinct around politeness, leave some for others. Don't take the last piece ran directly against Victorian table etiquette. The rules were not intuitive, they were learned, and knowing them was itself the whole point. The meal lasted by expectation at least an hour. 2 to 3 was ideal. Rushing a Victorian dinner was considered almost as bad as ruining one. It suggested that either the food was not good enough to linger over, or that the company was not pleasant enough to sustain the evening. And when the meal finally drew to its close, one final ritual sealed the evening's most visible enactment of the separate spheres. The hostess would give a barely perceptible signal, a slight rise from her chair, a quiet word, and the ladies would rise with her and process in order of their rank out of the dining room through the hall and into the drawing room. The gentlemen would stand as they left, standing until the last woman had cleared the door. And then once that door had closed, the tablecloth came off. Port and cigars appeared, and the men talked freely, openly about business, politics, money, power. The things that the doctrine of the separate spheres designated as theirs alone. The women, meanwhile, sat in the drawing room and had tea. I want to pause here and be honest about something that I think gets obscured when we talk about this ritual with too much nostalgic gloss. Separation of ladies and gentlemen after dinner was not simply a quaint custom. It was a physical architectural reproduction of the entire power structure of Victorian family life. The drawing room, that beautifully decorated, feminine-coded, morally serene space, was not a retreat. It was a holding room, a place to contain women while the real conversations of the age were conducted without them. The men who sat at that dinner table and talked about investments and legislation and the affairs of empire were not just enjoying a cigar. They were participating in the world of power. And the women who withdrew to brew tea were not just observing a pleasant custom. They were being once again gracefully excluded from it. What makes this particularly striking is that in many Victorian homes, the architecture itself enforced the separation. The Victorian country house, and increasingly the Victorian townhouse, was designed with gendered spaces built into its very walls. Men had the library, the billiard room, the study. Women had the morning room, the boudoir. The word boudoir incidentally derives from a French word meaning to sulk, which is either a delicious accident, etymology, or a quietly devastating piece of editorial commentary on the role of the Victorian woman's private room. Now here is what I find most extraordinary about all of this. The woman who ran the Victorian dinner party was in many ways its most skilled and powerful actor. She chose the guest list. She arranged seating plan. She managed the staff, briefed the cook, selected the menu, orchestrated the flowers, and ensured that the evening ran without visible effort. Because visible effort would have undermined the entire performance, the hostess was expected to produce a seamless, elegant 2-hour social event while appearing to have done almost nothing at all. Isabella Beeton, in her landmark 1861 book of household management, describes the mistress of a well-run Victorian household as resembling the commander of an army or the leader of any enterprise, coordinating moving parts, managing personnel, anticipating problems before they emerged. It is one of the most quietly radical sentences in Victorian literature, because what Beeton is describing in the language of military strategy is management. Real, sophisticated, consequential management of budgets, of people, of logistics, of social outcomes. She just couldn't call it that because management was a masculine word, and the work she was describing was officially just housekeeping. So let me ask you this, and I mean it genuinely. When you think about the most skilled social organizer you know, the person who seems to effortlessly host, who knows how to read a room, who instinctively understands the relationships and tensions between people and navigates them with grace, is there something Victorian about what they do? Because the skills that Victorian women developed to run those dinner tables, to read social hierarchies at a glance, to manage competing personalities around a table, to create an environment where everyone felt, however briefly, at their best. Those were not small skills. They were not merely domestic skills. They were in many ways the highest social arts of the era, practiced by people who were simultaneously performing in spite of navigating a structure that gave them responsibility without authority, influence without power, and admiration without respect. Which brings us naturally to the people who witnessed all of this. Every dinner, every course, every whispered seating arrangement and careful silence, the servants. If you want to understand the Victorian family, truly understand it beneath the polish and the presentation, you have to understand the people who lived inside those households while being officially invisible within them. The servant question is one of the most complex and quietly fascinating chapters in the entire story of Victorian domestic life. And that is precisely where we are headed next. Let me paint a picture for you. And I want you to pay close attention because there is something almost vertiginous about what I'm going to describe. It is 7 in the morning. The Victorian family is still asleep. The curtains are drawn. The house is quiet. But the house has been awake for 2 hours already. At 5 o'clock, the housemaids rose from their attic rooms, small coal, often shared, and began moving through the house in near darkness. They hauled coal, they laid fires, they swept grates, they cleaned floors and polished surfaces, and ensured that every room was restored to perfect, impeccable order before any member of the family opened their eyes. And all of this happened every morning without exception, in almost complete silence, because the most important rule governing a Victorian servant's working life was not about what they did. It was about what they were not supposed to be seen doing. Over 1 million people were employed as domestic servants. In England in 1851, 1 million. That figure made domestic service the second largest employment sector in the entire country, behind only agriculture. In the homes of the middle and upper classes, the presence of servants was not merely a convenience. It was a social statement, a visible proof of respectability. A family that could afford a cook and a housemaid was a family that had arrived. A family that could afford a full hierarchy of butler, housekeeper, footman, lady's maid, parlour maids, kitchen maids and scullery maids. That was a family of real standing. And in those grand Victorian houses, something remarkable was happening architecturally. The houses were being redesigned to make the servants disappear. Grand country houses and London town houses were built with what were called back stairs, entirely separate staircases and passageways that servants used to move through the building without intersecting with the family's daily path. There was a servant's entrance, plain and functional, tucked at the back or side of the building, completely separate from the grand front door, reserved for the family and their guests. The kitchen and servants' hall existed in the basement, often below ground level, lit by limited natural light. A world entirely parallel to the gleaming rooms above. The rule was unambiguous. Servants were to be felt but not seen. Like good infrastructure, the pipes in the walls, the cables underground, they were supposed to function perfectly, silently and invisibly. At Ashdown House in Berkshire, a beautiful 17th century property that has been studied carefully by historians, there was for much of its history only one internal staircase, which meant that on certain occasions, a servant moving through the house had no choice but to use the same staircase as the family or their guests. And the rule in such households when that happened was this: if a servant encountered one of the family or a guest on the stairs, they were to turn immediately and face the wall. No bow, no curtsy, no speech. Just to turn back, pressed against the plaster, until the person of a higher status had passed. Turn your face to the wall. Consider what that instruction actually required of a human being. Not merely to be unobtrusive, to actively erase your own presence, to render yourself architecturally, socially, humanly invisible at a moment's notice. Now, I've spent a good deal of time studying the Victorian servant question, and the more I see with it, the more I find it one of the most psychologically complex relationships in all of domestic history. Because here is the paradox at the heart of it. Servants were simultaneously the most intimate witnesses to Victorian family life and the people most aggressively excluded from it. They made the beds, they emptied the chamber pots, they carried the hot water upstairs for the morning bath. They cleaned the clothes still carrying the scent of the people who wore them. They stood silent in the corners of rooms while the family argued, wept, celebrated, confessed secrets over dinner that they believed no one else could hear. They knew in many cases more about the inner life of the household than any member of it, because they were present for everything while officially registering nothing. A footman standing by the sideboard during dinner maintaining a face of absolute stone while the master of the house discussed his financial troubles, or while the mistress complained about a daughter's unsuitable attachment. That footman was not absent. He was there listening, processing, and forbidden from acknowledging by word, expression, or any visible human response that any of it was occurring. Isabella Beeton in her book of household management stated as a near absolute principle that servants must speak only when spoken to. Eye contact was to be minimized, opinions were never to be offered, and a servant who appeared to be listening to a family conversation was guilty of eavesdropping, even if the conversation was happening 3 feet in front of them. Which brings me to a woman whose life I find myself returning to again and again when I think about this subject. Her name was Hannah Culwick. She was born in 1833 in Shropshire, England. And she entered domestic service at the age of 8, first on a farm, then as a pot girl, then as nursery maid, then as housemaid in a succession of middle and upper-class households across England and London. She spent 17 years keeping a diary. 17 volumes comprising several million words that constitute one of the most extraordinary first-person accounts of Victorian servant life ever written. In one entry from the 16th of July 1860, she records a single day's work with the calm precision of a military log, lit the fire, swept the birdroom and dusted the other rooms, cleaned 3 pairs of boots, got breakfast up and made the beds and emptied the slops, cleaned and washed up, put the linen for the wash, cleaned the brass rods and the bedroom windows and the sills, put up clean curtains, cleaned the knives and got dinner ready, cleaned away and then went upstairs and cleaned the bedrooms on my knees, got tea, cleaned away and washed up in the scullery, went out on errands and got supper ready, cleaned away and washed up and to bed at 11 o'clock. One day starting before dawn, ending at 11 at night, working on her knees for significant portions of it. And this was not an exceptional day. This was Tuesday. Here is something about Hannah Culwick that I find unexpectedly moving. She was proud of this work, genuinely, fiercely proud. The sheer volume of physical labor she could accomplish, the hundreds of pairs of boots she cleaned in a year, the fires she laid, the floors she scrubbed. She recorded these numbers with the satisfaction of someone who understood the value of what they were doing, even if the society around them systematically refused to. She viewed her labor as her identity, and she resisted. With a quiet and stubborn independence, every attempt by the people around her to diminish or sentimentalize it. Because Hannah Culwick had a secret. She was for 18 years the companion and later the secret wife of Arthur Munby, an upper-middle-class poet and lawyer, a Cambridge man who moved in literary and intellectual circles. They married in 1873 and kept that marriage hidden from almost everyone they knew until after their deaths, because the social gulf between them was considered so enormous, so transgressive that its revelation would have destroyed Munby's career and social position entirely. When their diaries were finally made public in 1950, he had stipulated they must not be released until 40 years after both their deaths. They provided historians with something almost without parallel, a window into the Victorian class system, as seen simultaneously from above and from below through the eyes of two people who had each chosen, for very different reasons, to live precisely on the border between those worlds. Hannah Culwick, servant, diarist, secret wife, refused to perform the social identity her class was assigned. When Munby urged her to dress as a lady to pass herself upward, she resisted. The work, she said, was what she was. The labor was her dignity. And yet I want to be careful here not to romanticize this, because for every Hannah Culwick, someone with the force of character to carve out a genuine inner life within a deeply constrained existence. There were thousands of Victorian servants for whom the system was simply exhausting, often lonely and regularly dehumanizing. The working hours were extraordinary. Advice manuals from the period outlined schedules that began before 5 in the morning and ended only after the household was fully settled for the night, sometimes as late as 11 o'clock. Sometimes later. 17-hour days were not unusual. Days off were typically one afternoon per fortnight. Sundays were reduced duty only. They were addressed by first name by their employers, who would have been horrified at the idea of anyone addressing them informally. And in some households, the custom went further. New maids were renamed upon arrival, given a name the household found convenient, discarding whatever name their own family had given them. A girl who arrived as Florence might become Mary, because the household already had a system for assigning kitchen staff names. The servant's actual identity, the self they had grown up with, the name their mother had chosen, was considered irrelevant to the domestic operation they were now part of. Is there anything that more precisely captures the Victorian servant's position than that you could be renamed? Your name, the most personal possession of any human being, could be changed, because it was more convenient that way. What strikes me most honestly is something that sits in the tension between two facts. Fact 1, the Victorian servant witnessed everything, every argument, every affectionate moment, every anxiety, every joy, every whispered conversation. They knew the family in many cases more deeply and completely than the family knew itself. Fact 2, the Victorian family officially did not acknowledge that the servant was there to have witnessed any of it. That gap between what was actually known and what was officially recognized seems to me to be one of the most defining characteristics of the Victorian domestic world. A world where what was real and what was publicly acknowledged were two different things maintained in careful, exhausting, mutually agreed upon separation. And it turns out that this capacity for elaborate, sustained social pretense, the ability to maintain a public face that said one thing while the private reality said quite another, was not limited to the relationship between employers and servants. It ran through everything. It ran through the way Victorian families talked about death, the way they performed grief, the way they turned mourning itself into a kind of theatre with its own rules, its own costumes, its own strictly regulated timetable for when you were allowed to stop looking devastated. Because in the Victorian world, even sorrow had a dress code, and that is the story we're going to explore next. Of all the hidden rules that shaped Victorian family life, this next one strikes me as the most theatrical, the most psychologically complex, and in its own strange way, the most deeply human. The Victorians had a dress code for grief. Not just a custom, not just a vague cultural preference for dark clothing after someone died, a precise, rigidly enforced, commercially supported, socially scrutinized dress code. One that told the world at a glance not only that you were mourning, but who had died, how long ago they had died, and how much you were expected to still be visibly suffering. And if you violated it, even accidentally, even in poverty, the social judgment could be severe. Let us begin where this whole, elaborate culture of grief truly crystallized with a single death. On the 14th of December 1861, Prince Albert, consort, intellectual partner of Queen Victoria, died at Windsor Castle at the age of 42, most likely of typhoid fever, though the exact cause has been debated by historians for over a century. He was in many ways the organizing intelligence of the Victorian royal household, the man who handled the children's education, the estate finances, the diplomatic correspondence, the domestic arrangements that made the palace function. Victoria was 42 years old. She had 9 children and over 3 decades of reign still ahead of her, and she never fully recovered. What followed was one of the most extended, most documented, and most publicly influential expressions of grief in modern history. Victoria entered mourning immediately as protocol required, but she did not exit it for 40 years. Until the day she died in 1901, Queen Victoria dressed almost exclusively in black. She wore a widow's cap of white tarlatan every day. She wore a miniature photograph of Albert around her neck. She slept with a cast of his hand on the bed beside her. At Windsor Castle, servants were required to change the bed linen in Prince Albert's bedroom every single day, and to leave a fresh jug of warm shaving water for him every morning, as though he might return at any moment and need to prepare himself. For 40 years, a dead man received fresh water for his morning shave, every day without exception. Victoria's grief was real. Nobody who has read her private letters can doubt the depth and sincerity of what she felt. But her mourning was also, whether she intended it to be or not, enormously influential, because the Victorian middle class was watching, and they took notes. Within months of Albert's death, the demand for black mourning fabric across Britain increased dramatically. Women who had never met Prince Albert, who lived hundreds of miles from Windsor, who had no direct connection to the royal tragedy, began to feel, or were made to feel by social pressure, that their own grief for their own dead ought to resemble the Queen's. The more elaborate, the more visible, the more prolonged the display of mourning, the more it spoke of love, of respectability, of moral seriousness. A whole economy rose up to meet this hunger. In 1841, 20 years before Albert died, which tells you the trend was already well established, a businessman named William Chick Hall created what he called Jay's London General Mourning Warehouse on Regent Street in London. It was in modern terms a one-stop grief department store. You could walk into Jay's within hours of a bereavement and walk out fully equipped for every stage of mourning. Crepe-trimmed gowns, black bombazine dresses, widow's caps in white tarlatan, black gloves, black bordered stationery, black-edged handkerchiefs, black jet jewelry, the only jewelry permitted in deep mourning carved from Whitby jet, a hard, dark mineral found on the Yorkshire coast. And if you could not afford Whitby jet, which was expensive, there were glass substitutes called French jet, mass-produced, to look almost identical from a distance. Jay's even commissioned its own etiquette handbook, A History of Mourning. A large illustrated volume that told readers exactly what to wear, in what combination for what relationship, at what stage of grief. If you were in any doubt about whether your mourning dress was appropriate, you could consult Jay's. The handbook was not just an act of public service. It was an act of marketing. Because the more complex the rules, the more products the grieving family needed to purchase. The mourning industry of the Victorian era, historians have estimated, was roughly equivalent in scale and social significance to the modern wedding industry. Grief, like marriage, had become a commercial event. Now, let me give you the actual rules because they were extraordinary in their specificity. A widow. Mourning her husband was expected to remain in what was called full mourning or deep mourning for at least 1 year and 1 day. During this period, her dress code was strictly non-negotiable. She wore only matte black fabrics, no shine, no luster, no silk, because any reflective surface suggested the possibility of vanity, which was incompatible with genuine sorrow. The accepted fabrics were crepe, a distinctively crimped, non-lustrous black gauze, and bombazine, a matte blend of wool and silk. Every accessory was black, her gloves, her boots, even the pins that fastened her dress. Her jewelry was restricted entirely to jet. Over her face, she wore a black crepe veil that could extend to chest length or longer, which she was expected to lower whenever she went outside. She could not go out in society except to attend church. She could not attend entertainments. She could not dance. She could not entertain visitors at home in any festive capacity. After 1 year, she transitioned to what was called second mourning, 9 months during which she could remove some of the crepe trim and add modest accessories. White linen collars and cuffs became acceptable. After that came ordinary mourning, 6 months of black silk, perhaps with jet jewelry, and finally half mourning. where she was permitted at last the colors grey, lavender and mauve, from death to the first tentative appearance of a color that was not black 2.5 years, and the rules extended far beyond widows. Child mourning a parent 1 year in black, a parent mourning a child 1 year, mourning a grandparent or sibling 6 months, an aunt or uncle 2 months, a first cousin 4 weeks. Castell's household guide even provided tables. You could look up exactly how long you needed to appear bereaved for any given family member as precisely as consulting a train timetable. For a man mourning his wife 3 to 6 months typically. Men, of course, were expected to return to work. Business did not pause for. Grief, at least not for a man's grief. I want to pause here and ask you something genuinely. Does any of this feel familiar? Not the black crepe and the jet jewelry and the widow's veil. Those are specifically Victorian. But the underlying idea that grief should be visible, that it should be performed in a way that others can evaluate, that showing too little sadness reflects badly on how much you love the person you lost, and showing too much for too long becomes socially inconvenient and makes everyone around you uncomfortable. That dynamic did not die with the Victorian era, just lost its dress code. There is a detail about the mourning fabric crepe that I have never been able to entirely shake from my mind. Crepe, the distinctive matte black fabric that was the visible symbol of Victorian widowhood, was frequently made using arsenic-based dyes. The women who wore it breathed in those dyes throughout the day. Prolonged exposure to the chemically treated fabric could cause respiratory problems, skin irritation, and in severe cases, blindness or worse. One Victorian etiquette manual that provided guidance on mourning dress also included at the end a recipe for removing black dye stains from fabric, and noted with characteristic Victorian practicality that the recipe was toxic and should only be mixed by a pharmacist to avoid poisoning the user. The symbolic language of grief was built in part from materials that could harm the people required to wear them. There is a metaphor there that I leave entirely for you to draw. Beyond the dress, the Victorian mourning culture extended into every corner of the domestic world. When a death occurred in the house, the mirrors were covered with black cloth, window blinds were drawn, the furniture was draped in dark fabric, stationery was bordered in thick black margins, the width of the margin indicating the depth of the loss, and families used this black bordered paper for all correspondence during the mourning period to receive. A letter on ordinary white stationery from a bereaved household was considered a breach of propriety. Hair jewelry reached its peak of popularity during the Victorian era. Locks of hair from the deceased were twisted, braided, and arranged into elaborate patterns behind glass in shadow box frames or woven into rings, brooches, and lockets. The hair of someone you had loved, their actual physical substance, the thing that remained when everything else was gone, was set in gold and kept against your skin. Queen Victoria herself wore a locket containing a miniature photograph of Albert and a curl of his hair until the day she died. Post-mortem photography became an established practice precisely because it was the only photograph many families would ever have of a child. Before inexpensive photography existed, painted portraits could preserve the wealthy. Photography democratized the captured image, but it was still expensive enough, and children still died so frequently from disease and accident that a post-mortem photograph taken within hours of death, the child posed in a parent's lap, sometimes held by a parent, often surrounded by flowers, was often the only image that would ever exist of that small person. The image and the grief preserved together in a single frame. I think about this often, how differently the Victorians understood the relationship between death and daily life. For us in the modern world, death has been almost entirely removed from the domestic sphere. People die in hospitals. Bodies are handled by professionals. The entire business of death has been outsourced efficiently, humanely, and in a way that shields the living from the reality of what has happened for as long as possible. For the Victorians, death happened in the house. The body was laid out in the parlor, which is where the phrase funeral parlor comes from. Family members sat with the dead. Children were brought to view the body. The grief was not managed or minimized or kept at clinical distance. It was domestic, physical, and intensely present. And while much of the Victorian mourning apparatus was undeniably about status and display, about the commercial exploitation of grief, about the unequal burden placed on women about rules so elaborate they could bankrupt a modest family, there was also something in it that I think deserves genuine consideration. They made space for grief. They built it into the architecture of daily life, into the calendar, into the visible language of what people wore and how they communicated. The black bordered letter said to everyone who received it, "Someone I loved has died, and I am still in that." The mourning dress said, "I am not yet back, not yet." The timeline, the measured formal progression from deep mourning through half mourning said loss takes time, and that time is recognized. We have lost something of that. I think something about the willingness to let grief be visible and communal and unhurried. And this is where the Victorian system reveals its most significant failure, the rules of mourning. Like so many of the rules we have been exploring throughout this video, fell most heavily on women. A widow's grief was regulated, prolonged, and publicly performed for 2.5 years. A widower's was largely over in 6 months, and he was expected to remarry relatively quickly. The man moved on. The woman waited, dressed in black, visible, socially withdrawn, until society decided she had waited long enough. Grief, like everything else in the Victorian domestic world, had a gender agenda built into it. But here is what I find myself returning to as we near the end of this part of our story. For all its rigid rules, for all its commercial exploitation, for all its inequality, the Victorian culture of mourning was fundamentally built on an acknowledgement that the people we love matter, that losing them changes us, that there should be a language for that change, even if the language Victorian society chose was flawed, oppressive in its asymmetries, and occasionally literally toxic. We have talked tonight about laws that erased women, ideologies that confined them, courtship rituals that turned love into negotiation, dinner tables that encoded hierarchy in the placement of forks, servants made invisible by architecture, and now grief itself turned into costume, into commerce, into performance. In every case, what strikes me is not only the constraint but the human. Life pressing against it. The Caroline Nortons writing pamphlets in the middle of the night. The Hannah Culwicks keeping diaries in secret. The young women who invented whole private languages of flowers just to feel something real. The Victorian family was not a prison. It was not a paradise. It was something more interesting and more painful than either. It was a place where real people with real longings and real intelligence tried to live fully inside a set of rules that had not been designed with their fullness in mind. And the money that surrounded all of it, the money that ran the household, the money that determined which rules you could afford to follow and which ones broke you. That is a story we have not yet told in full. It is perhaps the most consequential hidden rule of all, and it is exactly where we go next. Money. We've been circling it for the past several parts of this story in the marriage negotiations in the dinner table, hierarchies in the morning, warehouses that sold black crepe to grieving families who could barely afford it, but we have not yet looked at it directly. So let us look at it directly now. Because the unspoken rules around Victorian family finances were, in my view, among the most psychologically damaging of all the hidden rules we're exploring tonight. More damaging in some ways than the legal constraints on women, more damaging than the doctrine of separate spheres. Because the rules about money created a particular kind of suffering that was entirely invisible from the outside. A suffering that was almost by definition forbidden from being acknowledged at all. The Victorians had a word for what they were all chasing. Respectability, and respectability at its most fundamental level cost money. Here is something that a Victorian etiquette writer put into print in 1888, the kind of sentence that once you encounter it, you cannot read. A person of the middle class appreciates the value of the position he occupies, and he will not marry if marriage will so impoverish him as to render it necessary to resign his social position. Will not marry if marriage would force him to resign his social position. That sentence is doing something remarkable. It is saying with complete matter-of-factness that the decision of whom to marry, one of the most intimate choices a human being makes, was subordinate to the question of whether you could afford to maintain your social standing afterward. And the social standing in question was not principally about aristocratic title or political influence. It was about something far more tangible and far more precarious. It was about whether your household looked the right way, whether you had the right address, whether your wife's dress was made from good cloth, whether there was at least one servant, whether you could afford the mourning crepe when someone died, whether, in short, you appeared to be the kind of people you were pretending to be. Charles Dickens, the novelist who understood Victorian money anxiety more clearly than almost anyone, based the character of Mr. Micawber in David Copperfield largely on his own. Father John Dickens, a clerk in the Navy Pay Office who earned a decent salary by the standards of the time and still managed to land his entire family in financial catastrophe. His father's income was respectable. His spending was not. In 1824, when Charles was 12 years old, his father was arrested for debt and sent to the Marshalsea prison. Charles himself was pulled from school and put to work in a blacking factory, pasting labels onto bottles of shoe polish. A humiliation so deep, so searing that he never spoke of it publicly during his lifetime. and wrote about it only in a private autobiographical fragment he gave to his friend and biographer John Forster. But that experience, the terror of watching respectability collapse overnight, of having everything that defined your family's position stripped away by it, drove virtually every word Dickens ever wrote. The obsessive attention to clothing in his novels, to addresses, to the texture of furniture, to the way characters hold their forks. All of it is Dickens documenting with fierce precision the semiotics of class and money in Victorian England. And his Mr. Micawber gave the era its most famous piece of financial wisdom, expressed in the form of an equation so elegantly simple it has survived nearly 200 years. Annual income £20. Annual. Expenditure £19, 19 shillings and 6 pence result happiness. Annual income £20, annual expenditure £20 and 6 pence result misery. 6 pence over your income. That was all it took. The margin between dignity and catastrophe in the Victorian middle class was 6 pence. Now let me tell you what that catastrophe actually looked like, because it was not abstract. Victorian bankruptcy was a public event. When a Victorian businessman or head of household filed for bankruptcy, which the law required under the Bankruptcy Act of 1869, the proceedings were public. The newspapers had full access to the first creditors' meeting, which typically happened within a month of filing. If the case was considered newsworthy, and any bankruptcy involving a family with social pretensions almost certainly the full details of the debtor's finances would be printed in the local newspaper. His income, his debts, his expenditures, the specific items he'd been unable to pay for, everything that had been kept behind closed doors, maintained with careful performance, curated with daily effort, all of it exposed in print for the neighbors to read over their morning tea. The public examination that followed the first meeting was held in open court. Anyone who wanted to watch could attend, and the debtor was cross-examined on every detail of his financial life in public under oath. That is not simply a financial humiliation. That is a social death. And for the Victorian middle-class family who had spent years, sometimes decades, maintaining the appearance of respectable solvency, the exposure of hidden debt was in many ways worse than the debt itself. Which brings me to the thing that I find most extraordinary about Victorian family finances, and it is something that barely gets mentioned in popular histories because it is not glamorous, and it involves spreadsheets rather than ball gowns. An enormous proportion of Victorian middle-class families were living quietly and anxiously beyond their means. Not dramatically beyond, not in ways that would have been immediately visible, but the relentless pressure of respectability, the servants you needed to maintain your status, the address you needed, the school fees for the children, the gowns for the wife, the mourning clothes when grandparents died, the calling cards, the dinner parties you were expected to host in return for those you had attended. All of it added up to an expenditure that frequently outpaced income by a margin that could not be sustained indefinitely. One 1888 article in the 19th Century magazine examined the finances of a single male clerk earning 50 guineas a year, about £52, and found that after rent, food, clothing appropriate to his station, and the basic costs of maintaining respectable appearances, he had essentially nothing left, and this man had no family to support. A middle-class family of 5 with 3 children requiring education and a wife requiring the appearance of not needing to work, living in a terrace house near Kensington Gardens with a cook and a housemaid. That family needed a minimum of £500 to £700 a year to maintain respectability. And many of the men attempting to support that life were earning significantly less. The gap was filled with debt, with careful management of tradesmen's credit accounts, with the strategic postponement of bills, with quiet loans from relatives, with the pawning of items that could not be missed from the household inventory for a few weeks. It was filled above all with performance, with the daily work of appearing to be fine. And over all of this anxiety, like a shadow stretching across every generation of the Victorian landowning class, fell the law of entail and primogeniture. You have perhaps encountered this concept through Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, where Mr. Bennet's estate is entailed to pass to a male heir, meaning that his 5 daughters and their mother will be left with nothing when he dies. Austen treats the entail as a comic source of anxiety for the ridiculous Mrs. Bennet, but the economic reality it represents was not comic at all. The English system of primogeniture, the requirement that land and estates pass whole and undivided to the eldest son, was designed originally to prevent the fragmentation of great estates across multiple generations. It kept the land intact, it preserved the family name and the family seat across centuries, but it also meant this: every other child in an aristocratic or gentry family received in the most fundamental sense nothing. The younger sons received an allowance, perhaps a small legacy, perhaps a commission in the army or a position in the church or law. The daughters received a dowry and the expectation of a good marriage. But the estate itself, the land, the income, the name on the deed went exclusively to the eldest son. And even the eldest son, once he inherited, was in many cases legally bound by the terms of the entail not to sell, or mortgage or subdivide the land. He could not turn it into cash even if he needed to. He was required to pass it whole to his own eldest son. He was in effect a steward of the family property for his lifetime rather than its true owner. Adam Smith, writing in the 18th century, called primogeniture and entail laws fit only to support the pride of family distinction and said they made beggars of all but the firstborn. He was not wrong. What I want you to feel underneath all these legal structures.
Financial anxieties is the psychological weight this placed on individual families. Think of the Victorian father, middle-class, professional, respectable, who knows his income is insufficient for the life his family's position requires. Who watches his wife purchase the morning crepe for a distant cousin and understands that this expenditure has come directly from next month's rent. Who knows that the school fees for his son are due in 6 weeks and that the account with the tailor is already
3 months past settled. Who sits at his dinner table in his role as the dignified, composed head of household, the paterfamilias, the patriarch, the provider, and says absolutely nothing about any of it. Because to say something would be to break the facade. And the facade in Victorian England was not vanity, it was survival. Now, let me ask you something directly. Does this pattern, the middle-class family quietly drowning in the cost of appearing not to drown, feel like it ended in 1901? Because I don't think it did. I think most of us in the modern world live with some version of this anxiety. The pressure to project the right image on the right platform. The appearance of a life that costs more than it returns. The quiet, private terror of the gap between what you look like and what you actually have. The Victorians did not invent this particular human experience, but they built a culture in which the performance of respectability was so non-negotiable, so socially enforced, architecturally embedded in every aspect of daily life that failing to maintain it felt not like a personal misfortune, but like a moral failure. And that connection between money and morality, between financial instability and personal shame, is something Victorian culture passed down through generations in ways that are still, I would argue, very much alive. But here is what strikes me most about this entire story of Victorian family finances. The families who suffered most from the pretense were often the ones working hardest to maintain it, the genuinely wealthy with their actual estates and their diversified investments and their government bonds paying 3% annually. They were not anxious about respectability. They were respectability. It was the people one rung below them straining to reach the same ledge who paid the highest price. And within those straining families there was almost always someone who knew the full truth of the financial situation and said nothing. Usually, wife who'd been raised to manage the household gracefully, to make less look like more, to produce an impeccable dinner party on a budget that had no business producing one, and to do all of this without ever raising the subject directly with the guests, the children, or the neighbors. The hidden rule of Victorian family money was this: you could be privately desperate as long as you were publicly composed. That is the rule. It shaped everything, and it shaped something else too. Something that we have not yet fully explored in this story. Because the anxiety about money, about respectability, about what the neighbors knew and did not know was always threaded through with secrets. Every Victorian family at every level of society carried things that were not spoken about. Not just financial things, deeper things. Things about who a family member really was. Things hidden so thoroughly, maintained so carefully that sometimes even the people within the family did not know the full truth. The locked room, the hushed voice, the relative nobody mentioned, the child who was called a cousin when they were something else entirely. The Victorian family kept secrets the way modern families keep passwords as tools of protection, whose loss could bring down everything. And in those secrets, in what the Victorians chose to hide and why, and at what cost is perhaps the darkest and most revealing chapter of this entire story. That is exactly where we are headed next. There is a particular kind of silence that Victorian families maintained, not the silence of peace, but the silence of concealment, the silence of things known and never spoken, things passed over at the dinner table with a slight practiced change of subject, things understood to exist and understood to be permanently invisible. Every Victorian family had its locked room. Not necessarily a literal locked room, though sometimes, as we will see, it was exactly that. More often it was a locked subject, a locked name, a locked child, a locked marriage, a locked identity. something tucked away so thoroughly that it became over decades almost indistinguishable from the architecture of the house itself. And what makes Victorian family secrets so remarkable, so worth spending time on tonight, is not their content. It is the extraordinary effort that went into maintaining them. The daily, vigilant, collectively sustained labor of keeping the unlockable locked. Let us begin with the most common secret of all, illegitimacy. At the dawn of the 20th century in England alone, some 65,000 children were being born outside of marriage every single year, in a society that had constructed an elaborate moral apparatus around the sanctity of the family, around the virtue of women, around the purity of respectable domesticity. 65,000 children annually who arrived into the world as visible proof that some part of that apparatus had failed. For families with social pretensions, the discovery of an illegitimate child, a daughter's pregnancy before marriage, a son's child by a servant, a wife's child by someone other than her husband, represented not just a personal crisis, but an existential one. Illegitimacy was considered among respectable Victorian families not merely a moral failing, but something disturbingly close to a contagion. One influential view held that it was a sign of moral weakness passed through the bloodline itself, that the illegitimate child carried the taint of its origins in its very character. The consequence of this belief was a system of secrets so thorough, so architecturally embedded in family life that historians studying the period have found traces of it in archives that were sealed for over a century. One document that the historian Deborah Cohen uncovered in her research describes with quiet devastation a scene on a railway platform in Liverpool. A mother is handing over her 8-year-old illegitimate son for adoption. She has dressed him carefully that morning in a sailor suit and cap, and then she gives him to strangers on a platform, turns and walks away. He is 8 years old. He is dressed in his best clothes and he will never see his mother again. There is no scandal that reaches you quite like that image. But illegitimacy was only one category of the secrets Victorian families kept. There was another category, one that the Victorians were both more and less equipped to handle than we might expect. Mental difference. What? The era called madness or lunacy or idiocy. Terms that covered everything from genuine psychiatric illness to what we would now recognize as intellectual disabilities, autism, depression, and eccentricity. Here is something remarkable that historians have discovered, unlike adultery or illegitimacy, which carried the heavy stain of moral failure. A child born with cognitive differences carried in the Victorian moral framework no personal shame. The backward child, as they were called, was not the result of a wicked choice. They simply were what they were. And so Victorian families frequently kept these children at home, sometimes for decades, with a tenderness that challenges the caricature of the cold, unfeeling Victorian parent. But as the century progressed, and as the new science of heredity began to take hold, the idea that traits were passed through bloodlines, that families could be categorized by their genetic fitness, the calculus began to shift. A child with disabilities began to carry a different kind of stigma. Not the shame of moral failure, but the shame of bad blood. And so the institutions multiplied, not workhouses necessarily for families with means. They were expensive, well-run private establishments that cost as much as the best public schools, and the children in them were often genuinely cared for. But they were also systematically made to disappear from family correspondence, from family photographs, from family narrative. A 1-year-old daughter committed to an institution and barely visited or referred to by her family ever again. Cohen found this case in a sealed archive. Just that sentence, a 1-year-old daughter, barely referred to again. And then there was the secret that Victorian law made uniquely terrifying, not because it was common, but because the possibility of it hovered over the life of every married woman who was inconvenient enough to be noticed. The threat of the lunatic asylum. Under Victorian lunacy law, a person could be certified insane and committed to an asylum on the signature of just 2 doctors. In practice, this meant that a husband who wanted to be rid of a difficult, expensive, or simply annoying wife had a tool available to him that required no evidence of actual insanity, only 2 cooperative physicians, and a willingness to frame eccentricity as pathology. Scholars estimate that a significant proportion of Victorian asylum patients exhibited no clear signs of mental illness at all. Some were committed for reasons as banal as disobedience or religious enthusiasm or sexual non-compliance, or simply for insisting on living according to their own preferences rather than their husbands'. And the law provided almost no protection against this. Once certified, the patient's only real recourse was through visiting commissioners, and if those commissioners had already accepted the original certification, they were deeply reluctant to contradict it, lest they appear to undermine their own system. Patients could spend years in some documented cases, over a decade in asylums while perfectly sane with almost no legal mechanism for escape. The case that brought all of this into public view, and that is worth telling in full because it is one of the most extraordinary stories of the entire Victorian era, is the case of Georgina Weldon. On the 14th of April 1878, two men came to call at Georgina's home in Bloomsbury, the house that had previously been a residence of Charles Dickens, which she and her husband Harry had leased. She was 40 years old, an amateur soprano of genuine talent and deeply unconventional by the standards of her time. She wore her hair short. She was a vegetarian. She ran a musical orphanage for poor children. She attended spiritualist séances at a time when spiritualism was fashionable among a significant portion of educated Victorian society, including poets, scientists, and at least one prominent detective fiction writer. When the two men arrived and were shown into the library, they found Georgina up a ladder dusting books. The men had been briefed on her strange behavior beforehand and had obtained an interview with her under false pretenses. They claimed to be interested in her musical orphanage. They were in fact asylum doctors summoned by her estranged husband Harry, who wanted her committed, primarily so he could pursue a relationship with another woman and reduce his financial obligations to Georgina. They had already signed the lunacy order. More staff arrived that evening and the next day. Georgina realized something was wrong, rallied the help of household staff and a fellow spiritualist who fetched the police and went on the run, moving from house to house, staying with sympathizers for 7 full days until the warrant expired. She had narrowly escaped by 7 days, and when she tried to take legal action, she discovered something almost as horrifying as the original attempt itself. Under the existing law, a married woman could not bring a civil suit against her husband without his permission. The man who had just tried to have her imprisoned was the man whose consent she needed to sue him. The magistrate who heard her case was sympathetic and entirely helpless. Georgina Weldon did not accept this. She went to the newspapers instead. She gave interviews. She published pamphlets, including one with the remarkable title, "How I Escaped the Mad Doctors." She became, as celebrities in the modern sense, become a public figure through the sheer force of her refusal to be quiet about what had happened to her when Married Women's Property Act finally passed in 1882 and gave women the legal standing to bring civil suits in their own name. Georgina launched herself into the courts with what can only be described as breathtaking enthusiasm. She sued her husband. She sued the doctors. She sued everyone involved in the attempt to confine her. She represented herself. Without a lawyer at a time when women were not permitted to practice law professionally, and she eventually had 17 cases running simultaneously, she became known as the Portia of the law courts. Her image appeared everywhere. Pear Soap used her face in advertisements with the caption, noting that though she was 50, her complexion was that of a girl of 17, which is, when you think about it, a deeply Victorian moment. A woman who had escaped wrongful imprisonment, campaigned for lunacy law reform, and won over 20 court cases being used to sell complexion cream. But her campaigns contributed to real legal reforms, and her case remains one of the most vivid illustrations of something that Victorian society was both acutely aware of and determinedly silent about, that the domestic space celebrated as a sanctuary could also function for the wrong women, as a trap from which there was almost no legal exit. I want to pause here and ask you something because I think it matters. When you hear these stories, the child on the railway platform in a sailor suit, the 1-year-old daughter committed at the age of 1, Georgina Weldon, on the run for 7 days through London. Do you feel that these are distant, historical, safely contained tragedies, or does something in them feel uncomfortably close? Because here is what I keep returning to. These were not stories of monsters. The families who gave away their illegitimate children were not, for the most part, cruel people. They were frightened people. Frightened of the social consequences of visibility, frightened of what the neighbors would say, of what the loss of respectability would cost, of what happened to families whose secrets came to light. The Victorian family secret machine was not driven by malice. It was driven by fear, by the same fear that quietly shapes family life in every era. The fear that if the full truth of who we are and what we have done became visible, the social structures we depend on would not survive it. And there was one secret that Victorian society kept more carefully than all others, more carefully than illegitimacy, more carefully than madness, more carefully than debt or failed marriages or children sent away to institutions. It was kept in diaries sewn up in calico, wrapped in layers of parchment, locked in bank vaults, with instructions that they not be opened for decades. It was kept in friendships so profound, so sustaining, so central to the lives of the people who held them, that those people built entire hidden worlds around them, sometimes within households that knew and suspected nothing, sometimes within households where the secret was so open as to be almost architectural. A vicar in the Cotswolds, a respectable man, a man of the church, a man whose position required the daily performance of a particular kind of moral authority, carried his diary to his bank vault rather than leave it in his study. The diary, sewn up in fabric as though it were a wound that needed bandaging, chronicled his love for other men. He kept it his whole life. He sealed it. He locked it away. And we have it now. These are the things that make me stop honestly every time I come back to this material. Not the grand political dramas, not the legislation or the legal cases or the newspaper scandals, the diary in the bank vault, the child in the sailor suit, the woman up the ladder who had 7 days to stay free. These are the real hidden rules of Victorian family life, if not the rules that were written down and enforced by law, but the rules that were written on people's lives and enforced by silence, by the daily choice to hide rather than be seen, by the daily cost in energy and longing and quiet grief of maintaining a public face that said one thing, while the private truth said something else entirely. And what strikes me most, sitting with all of it, is this. The Victorian families who kept these secrets were not cowards. In many cases, they were desperately brave. They were doing what people in every era do when the social structures around them leave no safe space for the full truth of who they are. They were surviving. But not everyone survived quietly. There were people in the Victorian era who looked at the whole magnificent, suffocating apparatus, the separate spheres, the advice books, the mourning warehouses, the locked rooms, and chose to push back not secretly, openly. And their stories. The stories of the people who cracked the facade, who refused the cage, who built something new in the fractures of the old world, are the ones that in many ways matter most, because they are the reason so much of this changed. And that is the story we're about to tell. Something shifted in the last decade of the 19th century. Not gradually, not quietly, but with the energy of something that had been compressed too long, under too much weight, and finally inevitably began to push back. By the 1890s, the Victorian family's elaborate architecture of rules, the separate spheres, the advice books, the mourning timetables, the household hierarchies had been in place for more than half a century. An entire generation had grown up inside it, and some of them, upon reaching adulthood, looked at what had been built, and made a decision that sent shockwaves through respectable society, from London to New York to Sydney. They decided not to comply. Let us start with the simplest act of rebellion in the entire Victorian era. A woman, a bicycle, and the open road. The safety bicycle, the version with the chain drive and equal-sized wheels that we would recognize today, became widely affordable in the early 1890s. And what happened next was not on the surface a political revolution. It was just women riding bicycles unchaperoned down roads that had previously required a carriage and a driver, or at minimum a male escort to make the journey respectable. But the fury that greeted it was extraordinary. Doctors published earnest warnings about what cycling would do to the female body, including a diagnosis so magnificently absurd that it deserves to be read aloud: bicycle face. This was a condition allegedly caused by the muscular exertion of cycling and was described as characterized by a hard, clenched jaw and bulging eyes. Apparently, the simple act of propelling oneself forward on two wheels would permanently disfigure a Victorian woman's countenance. A German journalist observing women cyclists in 1897 wrote with barely contained revulsion. Have you ever seen anything more off-putting ugly meaner than a wench on a bike wheezing her face red like a turkey? Emma Eads, one of the first women to ride a bicycle in London, was attacked with bricks and stones by people who objected to the sight. With bricks and stones, a woman on a bicycle was threatening enough to the social order that strangers felt justified in throwing rocks at her. And yet, women continued to ride. In 1895, a 23-year-old American woman named Annie Londonderry Kopchowski mounted a bicycle in Boston, left behind her husband and 3 children, with whom, by all accounts, she had a perfectly ordinary domestic life, and cycled around the world, the entire world, in 15 months, wearing bloomers instead of a long dress, advertising products on her bicycle frame as sponsorship, and financing the journey through sheer force of personality and commercial ingenuity. She returned to Boston in September 1896 and gave interviews about her experience. The interviewer asked whether her husband had approved of the trip. She said she hadn't particularly asked. The woman on the bicycle became the emblem of something the era called the New Woman. a phrase coined in 1894 by English writer Sarah Grand to describe the emerging archetype of the educated, independent, economically self-sufficient woman who simply declined to organize her entire life around the needs of a husband. The new woman went to university. In Britain, the percentage of women in higher education was still tiny but growing, and the women who did get there were formidable. They studied medicine, law, classics, mathematics. They graduated with honors in subjects that their brothers had been educated to believe were constitutionally unsuited to the female mind. The new woman had a career, or wanted one. She had opinions about politics and expressed them publicly. She corresponded with people she had not been formally introduced to. She attended lectures and gave them. She sometimes chose not to marry, viewing spinsterhood not as a catastrophic failure, but as a reasonable alternative to the specific kind of diminishment that Victorian marriage had so long required. And she rode a bicycle without a chaperone. The response from conservative Victorian culture was, to put it diplomatically, unhinged. Satirical cartoons depicted the new woman abandoning her weeping husband and bewildered children at the door while she pedaled off to a suffragist meeting. Medical. Authorities suggested that too much intellectual work would damage women's reproductive capacity, that the uterus and the brain were in competition for limited bodily resources, and that if women insisted on filling their heads with Latin and mathematics, they would be leaving their wombs insufficiently supplied. This was presented as science. One Victorian postcard that circulated widely showed the new woman as a grotesque figure in bloomers, while her emasculated husband sat at home doing the washing. What I find fascinating about this reaction is not its cruelty, but its transparency. The conservative response to the new woman was in essence a direct admission of what the entire Victorian domestic scene was like. System had been built on the belief that women's confinement to the home was not a choice but a biological necessity. And when women began demonstrating quite visibly that the biological necessity had been invented, that they could ride bicycles and pass exams and argue cases without their uteruses malfunctioning, the people who had built their identities on the old certainty panicked. Now, while this was happening in the women's colleges and on the country roads of England, while women were quietly, persistently dismantling the domestic sphere from the outside, there was a man standing in the West End theatres of London doing something different. He was dismantling it from within. His name was Oscar Wilde. On Valentine's Day, 1895, the 14th of February, Oscar Wilde's play, The Importance of Being Earnest, opened at the St. James's Theatre in London. It was a dazzling success. The audience laughed. The critics praised it. Wilde was at the absolute pinnacle of his fame. The play is a comedy of manners. Two young men, Jack and Algernon, have each invented fictional identities that they use to escape the suffocating obligations of their respectable domestic lives. Jack tells his ward in the country that he has a terrible younger brother in London named Ernest, so he can escape to the city. Algernon tells his aunt that he has a desperately ill friend in the country named Bunbury, so he can escape to the countryside. Both men are in the language of the play Bunburying, maintaining elaborate fictional selves that allow them to live double lives while their actual selves remain imprisoned by respectability. The comedy of it is brilliant, but the critique buried inside it is devastating, because what Wilde was showing Victorian audiences with the most precise comic scalpel was the thing they had been doing for decades. The gap between the public performance of earnestness and the private reality of human desire. The exhausting permanent daily labor of being someone other than yourself in the service of social appearances. The way that Victorian respectability was not in practice a moral condition at all. It was a theatrical one. One of the play's most famous exchanges captures it perfectly. Gwendolyn's mother, the formidable Lady Bracknell, is interviewing Jack about his suitability as a husband. She discovers that Jack does not know who his parents were. He was found as an infant in a handbag at Victoria Station. Lady Bracknell's response is one of the most withering sentences in the English language. To lose one parent, Mr. Worthing, may be regarded as a misfortune. To lose both looks like carelessness. The joke is that Lady Bracknell is not concerned about Jack's feelings or about the mystery of his origins or about anything human at all. She's concerned about appearances, about what it looks like. The moral vocabulary of the Victorian domestic world had been replaced in her character with something entirely about social optics. And Wilde was pointing at it with the precision of a surgeon. What makes Wilde's story so remarkable and so genuinely painful is what happened next. Fewer than 3 months after The Importance of Being Earnest opened to triumph, Wilde was arrested. The Marquess of Queensberry, the furious father of Wilde's companion, Lord Alfred Douglas, had left a calling card at Wilde's club with a misspelled accusation scrawled on it. Wilde unwisely tragically decided to prosecute Queensberry for libel. The libel trial backfired catastrophically when Queensberry's lawyers produced witnesses who had had intimate contact with Wilde. And suddenly the hunter became the hunted. Wilde was tried, convicted, and sentenced to 2 years at hard labor for what the law called gross indecency. He was 40 years old. He was the most famous playwright in England.
He went to prison in May 1895.
The same man who had exposed the hypocrisy of the Victorian double life on stage was now its most famous victim in reality. His public success, his wit, his flamboyance, all of the things that had made him a celebrated figure were turned against him. His plays were removed from the West End stage. His name was taken off the playbills. His books were quietly removed from shelves. After 2 years in prison, he left England and died in Paris in 1900, age 46, in a cheap hotel under a false name. And yet the work survived. The plays came back. The importance of being earnest continued to be performed. The picture of Dorian Gray continued to be read. And what Wilde had said about the gap between Victorian performance and Victorian reality, about the cost of double lives, about the brutality of a society that demanded one face in public and allowed quite another in private, remained in the culture like a wound that would
Not close.
His grandson Merlin Holland has said that Wilde endures today because he represents 4 things: rebellion, integrity, individuality, and sensuality, all 4 of which the Victorian domestic system had worked very hard to suppress. I want to pause here and ask you something that I mean genuinely. When you think about the new woman on her bicycle and Oscar Wilde in the dock and Caroline, Norton writing pamphlets through the night and Georgina Weldon running from the asylum doctors, through the streets of London, what do you see? Because what I see when I sit with all of these stories together is not a series of isolated rebellions. I see the same impulse expressed in different registers by different people across different decades. The impulse to insist that you are a whole person, not a role, not a function, not a performance. A full, complicated, contradictory human being with needs and desires and a mind that cannot be folded neatly into the space that the rules have allotted for it. Every single person in this story, the women who rode bicycles and attended lectures and wrote pamphlets, the men who wrote satirical plays about double lives, the people who kept their diaries in locked bank vaults, every single one of them was responding to the same pressure. The pressure of a system that had decided with extraordinary thoroughness who you were supposed to be, and they said, no, actually, not quite. Something more than that, something wilder and truer and less defined. But here is what I want you to hold on to as we approach the final chapters of this story. None of these rebellions happened in isolation. Each one of them was connected, sometimes directly, sometimes through long chains of influence and consequence to the others. Caroline Norton's pamphlets changed custody law, which made it possible for later women to have more agency within the domestic sphere. The Married Women's Property Acts gave Georgina Weldon the standing to sue. The education. Reforms of the 1870s began training the women who would become the new women of the 1890s. The new women's rejection of the angel ideal created the cultural space in which Virginia Woolf would later write that the angel had to be killed before a woman could think freely. And Oscar Wilde, even from a prison cell, even in exile, even in the cheap Paris hotel where he died, left a crack in the wall of Victorian certainty that has never been fully sealed. Because the thing about hidden rules is that once you can see them clearly, once someone has held them up to the light and said, look what this actually is, you cannot quite unsee them. And that brings us finally to the part of this story that I have been building toward all evening. Because all of these rebellions and all of the systems they were rebelling against cast a shadow that extends far beyond 1895 or 1901 or the death of Queen Victoria. They extend into the world we're living in right now and understanding what we have. Inherited from Victorian family life, what we kept, what we rejected, and what we are still quietly carrying. That is the conversation waiting for us next. We've been traveling through time tonight, through courtship rituals and mourning warehouses, through locked rooms and back staircases, through the dinner tables of the middle class and the bicycle paths of rebels. And now, as we approach the final chapters of this long journey through Victorian family life, I want to do something a little different. I want to look forward instead of backward. Because everything we've been exploring tonight, the hidden rules, the silences, the performances of respectability, the gap between what Victorian families showed the world and what actually lived behind the parlour door. None of it ended when Queen Victoria died on the 22nd of January 1901. It echoed, it mutated, it softened in some places, hardened in others, changed its costume without changing its essential structure, and it travelled across the Atlantic, across generations, across the 20th century, until it arrived in forms we do not always recognize in the world we are living in right now. Let me start with the most concrete example of Victorian influence on modern life, because it is almost comically overlooked given how universal it is. Christmas. Every December, without thinking much about it, we participate in a set of rituals so deeply embedded in our sense of what the holiday should feel like that most of us assume they are ancient. The decorated evergreen tree in the corner, the cards sent to people we love, the gathering of the nuclear family around a table laden with food, the feeling sometimes genuine, sometimes anxious, sometimes both simultaneously that Christmas is primarily a time for family, and that the quality of your family life will be somehow measured and evaluated by how warmly and successfully you perform it. Before the 1840s, Christmas in Britain was a largely adult affair, noisy, communal, public, and focused more on church, village, community and general festivity than on the intimate nuclear family gathering. There was no Christmas tree in English homes. There were no Christmas cards. There was no Santa Claus in the form we would recognize. Most workers did not have Christmas Day off. Then Victoria and Albert positioned themselves at the center of the reinvention. The 1848 engraving in the Illustrated London News. The royal family gathered around their decorated tree at Windsor. Castle was seen by millions. Within a decade, Christmas trees had appeared in middle-class homes across Britain and then across America. Henry Cole commissioned the first commercially printed Christmas card in 1843. The same year, Charles Dickens published A Christmas Carol, which essentially argued that the measure of a person's moral worth was their warmth toward family and generosity toward the poor. Tom Smith invented the Christmas cracker in the late 1840s, inspired by French bonbons. 1870s, 11 to 12 million Christmas cards were being sent annually in Britain. In less than 30 years, the Victorians had engineered an entirely new cultural infrastructure for the holiday once centered on the nuclear family as the primary unit of celebration, on sentiment and domestic warmth as the highest values, on the elaborate gifting and gathering that we still practice today. And built into that infrastructure was the same quiet pressure that built into everything the Victorians designed. Pressure to perform the ideal, to have the right family, to display the right warmth, to produce the right abundance of good feeling at the table.
Does that sound familiar?
Because I feel it every December. But Christmas is the cheerful part of the Victorian legacy. There are less cheerful ones. The phrase stiff upper lip has its origins in the Victorian era, though historians of emotion have traced it to publications of the 1840s onward, when it began to appear in the British press as a description of the appropriate response to hardship. The idea is simple. When things go wrong, when someone dies, when you lose your job, when your marriage falls apart, when you are frightened or grieving or in pain, you do not show it. You maintain composure. You keep your emotions contained, visible only to yourself, never burdening others with the full weight of what you are feeling. This was not merely a personal preference in the Victorian era. It was a class marker. Emotional restraint was considered a sign of breeding, of education, of superiority over the coarser, less controlled emotional expressiveness of the working classes or of people from other cultures. The Marxist philosopher Walter Benjamin observed that Victorian middle-class culture was a culture of prestige through conspicuous consumption reinforced by the repression of emotion, where propriety, defined as the regulation and concealment of inner states, became the defining personality trait of the respectable person. This emotional culture was transmitted with extraordinary durability in the first half of the 20th century. It was reinforced again and again by the public school system, by the demands of imperial administration, by the catastrophic losses of 2 world wars that required people to grieve millions of dead, without collapsing into grief publicly because the national need for stoic continuation was too great. In 2017, Prince Harry publicly described the aftermath of his mother, Diana's death in 1997. He said he had shut down his emotions for nearly 2 decades, barely crying once, burying the grief, not talking about it, performing composure. His brother, Prince William, spoke publicly about the dangers of what he called the British stiff upper lip. The cultural pressure that had kept both of them from processing one of the most devastating losses of their lives. Two members of the royal family, the direct institutional descendants of Victoria and Albert themselves, describing being psychologically harmed by the emotional culture that Victoria and Albert had helped to create. The phantom, as Virginia Woolf might have said, is harder to kill than a reality. And there is something else the Victorians bequeathed us that I think deserves to be named. Directly because it operates so quietly in our lives that we rarely notice it until someone points it out. The idea that respectability is a moral condition. Throughout this video, we've been exploring how the Victorian middle class conflated financial stability with personal virtue, social performance with genuine goodness, the appearance of a well-ordered household with the reality of a well-lived life, the person who dressed correctly, managed their servants correctly, observed the right mourning periods, maintained the right address and the right social connections and the right public composure. That person was respectable. And in the Victorian moral vocabulary, respectability functioned almost as a synonym for virtue itself. This equation, wealth plus performance equals moral worth, did not die in 1897 or 1901. It is still operating. You can see it in the shame that surrounds debt and the pride that surrounds financial success in ways that have almost nothing to do with the actual moral content of either. You can see it in the anxiety that surrounds the appearance of homes, of children, of marriages. The sense that how things look says something fundamental about who you are. You can see it in the particular. Cruelty directed at people whose lives are visibly imperfect, and in the particular, admiration given to people whose lives on the outside at least appear immaculately managed. The Victorians did not invent this equation, but they industrialized it. They gave it advice books and mourning warehouses and architectural back stairs. They made it the operating system of an entire culture, and that culture's children carried it forward into the next century and the century after that. Now I want to be careful here because this story is not only about what was wrong. Something genuinely remarkable happened in the Victorian era alongside all of the constraint and the hypocrisy and the exhausting performance of respectability. Something that I think we're sometimes too quick to dismiss precisely because we are so aware of the injustices. The Victorians took family seriously. Not always correctly, not always fairly, frequently with monstrous inequity, with the wrong people bearing the wrong burdens, but genuinely, earnestly, intensely, seriously. They built institutions around the idea that children deserved protection. Imperfect, often brutal institutions by modern standards, but the beginning of a legal framework that recognized childhood as a distinct and vulnerable condition requiring care. The first laws protecting children from labor in factories passed in Victorian England. The National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children was founded in 1884. They invested in the idea that the domestic space could be something more than a place of mere survival, that it could be a place of warmth, of cultivation, of genuine human connection. The enormously over-decorated Victorian parlour, with its layered textiles and its potted ferns and its framed photographs and its elaborate centerpieces. That room was, whatever its pretensions, an attempt to make a beautiful and comfortable place for people who mattered to each other. And the Victorians, even the most rule-bound, most rigidly conventional of them, loved deeply, sometimes painfully, in ways that their culture gave them almost no language to express, but in ways that show up unmistakably in their private letters and their diaries, and in the particular attention they paid to the things they made for the people they cared about. Here is a question I genuinely want you to sit with because it matters to me, and I think it might matter to you when you think about the Victorian rules we have been exploring all evening. The stiff upper lip, the pressure of respectability, the separate spheres, the carefully maintained performance of the ideal family. How much of that have you actually left behind? Not in theory, in practice. Do you feel sometimes the pressure to appear as though your family life is more harmonious than it is? To project composure when you're not composed? To maintain a public self that is somewhat edited, somewhat curated, somewhat cleaner and more ordered than the private self you actually live with? Do you feel the old Victorian equation that how things look is in some important sense who you are operating in the choices you make about what to show and what to hide? I ask not to be accusatory. I ask because I feel it myself honestly, and I think recognizing it is the beginning of something more interesting than just identifying a problem. The Victorians who interest me most, the ones whose stories I return to again and again in my research, are not the rule makers. They are the rule negotiators. The women who managed their households with extraordinary skill and simply did not mention to anyone that they also wrote pamphlets in secret. The men who maintained respectable domestic lives and kept their more complicated inner lives in letters that could not be opened until they were dead. The new women who rode their bicycles through streets where people threw rocks at them and went home and sat down to dinner with their families as though nothing unusual had happened that afternoon. These people did not, for the most part, reject the Victorian world wholesale. They could not afford to. They lived in it within its structures and dependencies. But they also made small, persistent, quietly courageous adjustments to the rules. Adjustments that accumulated over decades and generations into something that looked eventually like change. And I think that is actually how most genuine social change works. Not through dramatic total rupture, though. Those moments exist, but through the daily accumulation of small decisions to live a little more honestly than the rules strictly require. To extend a little more grace to yourself than the advice books prescribe, to acknowledge to yourself at least the gap between the performance and the reality, and to treat that gap not as shameful evidence of failure, but as normal evidence of being human. Queen Victoria died on the 22nd of January 1901. She was 81 years old. She'd been queen for 63 years and 216 days. She had 9 children, 40 grandchildren, and 87 great-grandchildren. She had outlived her husband by 40 years and worn black every single day of those 40 years. In her final days, she was surrounded by family, not the idealized family of the paintings and photographs, but the actual family with all its complications and rivalries and old wounds and genuine love. Her son Edward, whom Albert had considered a disappointment and who would become king, stood at her bedside. She was buried with a cast of Albert's hand placed beside her, a lock of his hair. The last photograph taken of them together. Whatever else the Victorian era was, and it was many things, some of them beautiful and some of them deeply unjust at its center, was this 2 people who had made a life together and had made it matter, and who had, for better and for worse, and in ways none of them could have fully anticipated, shaped how an entire culture would think about what a family was supposed to be. We carry that legacy, all of us, not as a burden to resent, not as an ideal to restore, but as something to understand, to see clearly with both its gifts and its costs, so that we can make slightly more conscious choices about which parts we keep and which parts we are finally ready to let go. That is the work of every generation. And it begins, as most real work does, with the willingness to look honestly at what is actually there, which is exactly what we've been doing tonight. And there is one
more thing we need to say before we put this chapter to rest. One final personal reflection on what all of this means, not just as history, but as something that lives in you and me and the families we are part of right now. That conversation is the last one waiting for us. Right at the very end of the Victorian era, in the final years of the old Queen's reign, a young Austrian doctor in Vienna was doing something that would have horrified the polite society of any Victorian drawing room. He was asking people to talk about their families openly, honestly, in detail, about their mothers and fathers, about what had happened to them as children, about the things they had never said to anyone, about the gap, that gap we had been circling all evening between who they were supposed to be and who they actually were. His name was Sigmund Freud, and whatever you think of his specific theories, and historians and psychologists have been arguing about them vigorously ever since what he did at the turn of the 20th century was in its cultural context almost radical enough to take your breath away. He suggested that what people experienced inside their families in childhood, in the hidden private world of the domestic space, was not trivial. It was not something to be kept quiet and managed and performed around. It was in fact the very substance of who a person became, the material from which their adult self was built. In the Victorian world, that idea was dangerous. In our world, it has become so familiar that it is the premise of an entire industry. Think about that for a moment. We are living in an era that has, at least in our public discourse, in our therapy culture, in our best-selling memoirs, and our podcast conversations, completely inverted the Victorian emotional code. Where the Victorians prized the stiff upper lip, we prize emotional authenticity. Where they kept family secrets in bank vaults sewn in calico, we write them into best-selling books and then discuss they at length on morning television. Where the Victorian family performed composure, the contemporary family is supposed to perform transparency. And I find myself wondering sometimes whether we have actually changed as much as we think we have, or whether we have just found a new performance to give. Because here is something that I have turned over many times as I've researched this story. The Victorian rules around family life were not at their deepest level about specific behaviors.
were not really about the exact correct way to address a duke at dinner or the precise number of months of crepe a widow should wear for a second cousin. Those were symptoms. The rules were about something more fundamental. They were about the management of anxiety. The anxiety of living in a world that was changing faster than anyone could fully process. Industrializing, urbanizing, expanding through empire into territories and cultures that challenged every comfortable certainty. The English. Middle class had built its self-understanding on the anxiety of a social structure that was being constantly renegotiated, where the boundaries between classes were more permeable than they had ever been, where the rules of respectability were both more important and more contested than at any previous moment in history. The rules were a response to that anxiety. They were a way of saying, in a world this uncertain, at least we know how to behave at the dinner table. At least we know what the
Widow is supposed to wear in the third month of mourning.
At least we know who sits where and who speaks when, and what the butler is not supposed to acknowledge that he has heard. The performance of order in the face of profound disorder. Does that sound familiar? Because I think it should. We live in a world of extraordinary accelerating change. The pace of transformation, technological, social, environmental, political, is by most measures faster than it has ever been. The old certainties about gender and family and class and national identity are all being renegotiated simultaneously. The ground that people built their self-understanding on is shifting in real time. And in that context, in that anxiety, we are also building rules, different rules than the Victorians built. Rules more often expressed in the language of wellness and authenticity and progressive values rather than in the language of advice books and morning timetables, but rules nonetheless. Rules about how to talk about your family, what words to use, what to acknowledge, what constitutes appropriate vulnerability versus inappropriate oversharing. Rules about the correct performance of the right kinds of relationships. Rules about what a good parent looks like, what a good partner looks like, what a good person managing their emotional life looks like in the year we are currently living in. Different rules, same impulse. The desire to manage through prescribed behavior the anxiety of being a human. Being in a complicated world. I am not saying our rules are wrong. Some of them are considerably better than the Victorian ones. Just more honest, less willing to sacrifice individual well-being on the altar of social appearance. But I think it is worth noticing that we are still rule-making, that the advice book has not been abolished. It has just changed its platform. And yet, and here is where I want to leave you tonight, because this is the part that genuinely moves me. For all rules, for all the constraints, for all the hidden rooms and the locked secrets and the performances of respectability, and the exhausting gap between the public self and the private one, the Victorian era also produced something that deserves to be named clearly. It produced people who refused, not in grand gestures, not always, but in small, daily, persistent, costly acts of insistence on the reality of their own inner lives. The woman who wrote pamphlets in the night while the household slept. The housemaid who kept a diary across 17 volumes that documented her days with the pride of someone who understood that her work was real and mattered, even when the world she worked in told her it was invisible. The woman who ran from asylum doctors through the streets of London for 7 days protecting her own sanity by sheer force of will. The playwright who stood in a courtroom and lost everything but never pretended to be something he was not, and whose words outlasted his prosecutors by more than a century. These people were not heroic because they were exceptional. They were heroic because they were ordinary. Ordinary people doing the difficult daily work of staying true to themselves inside structures that had been carefully designed to make that impossible. I want to ask you one final question, and I want you to take it seriously. If you had been a middle-class woman or man in Victorian England, with all of its rules and all of its expectations and all of the social machinery, designed to tell you exactly who you were supposed to be, what would you have done? Would you have complied? Most people did most of the time. That is not a moral failing. That is survival. That is the recognition that the social contract, however unjust, is also the thing that provides housing and food and community and safety. Most people in most eras work within the system rather than against it because the costs of working against it are too high. Or would you have been one of the negotiators, the people who found the cracks in the rules and quietly, persistently pressed against them, not breaking them dramatically, but bending them just enough to allow a real life to be lived inside them? Or would you have been one of the rare few who looked at the whole edifice and said with whatever it cost, "No, I genuinely do not know what I would have done. I like to think I would have been braver than I probably would have been. I think most of us do. The test of character Always easier in the abstract than in the moment, with your reputation and your safety and your children's futures on the line. But I think the asking of the question matters because it connects us to these people not as historical subjects, not as figures in a painting dressed in their beautiful restrictive clothes, posed for a photographer in the parlor of a world that no longer exists, but as fellow human beings, navigating the same fundamental problem that we're all still navigating. Problem of how to be a whole person inside a world that consistently prefers half of you. And so, as this long evening draws toward its close, let me tell you what I take away from all of it. Not an argument, not a lesson, just an observation offered with genuine affection. The Victorian family was imperfect, profoundly, sometimes devastatingly imperfect. The rules it lived by caused real harm to real people, to women whose intelligence was confined to parlors, to children whose emotional needs were systematically ignored, to people whose identities were designated unspeakable, to families whose poverty was framed as a moral failing rather than an economic condition. And the Victorian family was also, alongside all of that, a place where people loved each other, where letters were written and kept for decades and passed down through families, where mothers sat up at night with sick children, where fathers wrote entries in their diaries about their children's first words and first steps, where people found ways inside all those rules to make jokes and tell stories and care for each other with the tenderness that the rules gave them almost no language to express, but that shows up unmistakably in the record of their lives. The Victorian family was, in other words, exactly what every family in every era is: an attempt, imperfect, costly, flawed, and real. An attempt to build something that holds together, something that keeps the children fed and the household running, and the loneliness at bay, and the love present and the future connected to the past. It did not always succeed. It succeeded more than we sometimes give it credit for. And its failures were not the failures of malice. They were the failures of limitation of a society that had not yet found the language or the courage or the structural will to distribute the cost more fairly. We have found more of that language. We have built more of that structural will. We are still working on the courage. There is one. Last thing. At the very end of Queen Victoria's life, in those final days at Osborne House, surrounded by family, the light coming through the windows in January, her doctor noted something in his records. He wrote that in her final hours she seemed peaceful, that she slept, that the people she loved were near. He made no note of the mourning dress she would have been wearing. He made no note of the protocol observed or violated. He made no note of who sat where or what title was used or what the correct procedure was for the death of a sovereign. He noted that she was at peace, that the people she loved were near. All the rules, all the performances, all the elaborate machinery of respectability and propriety and social order. And at the end, what the doctor thought worth writing down was the simplest human fact. She was not alone. That is what I keep coming back to every time I research this period. Beneath all the rules, beneath the advice books and the mourning warehouses and the back staircases and the locked rooms, beneath the facades and the secrets and the performances and the hidden diaries sewn in calico and locked in bank vaults. Beneath all of it, people were doing what people have always done, reaching for each other, trying in whatever ways their time and culture allowed them to not be alone. Thank you, genuinely. I mean that with my whole heart. If you have spent the last 2.5 hours with me inside this world, inside the parlors and the morning rooms and the servant staircases and the hidden lives of the Victorian family, then you have given me something precious. Your time, your attention, your willingness to sit in the quiet and let history be slow and complicated and human. If any part of this story surprised you or moved you or made you think about something in your own life slightly differently, then please drop a comment and tell me which part. The servants, the courtship rules, the mourning, the bicycle, I read every single one. If are watching on a channel you've not yet subscribed to and you found yourself still here at the very end, that is the best signal I know of that this is a place you want to stay. The subscribe button costs nothing and it means a great deal. And one more thing, the story we have been telling tonight about how families work, about the hidden rules that shape the lives we live, is far from over. There is another time, another place, another set of hidden rules waiting for us. A world just as elaborate and just as human, just as beautifully imperfect in its own particular way. Stay close. Good night, sweet dreams.